Part 22 of the Book of the National Parks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Book of the National Parks by Robert Sterling Yard. The Healing Waters. Hot Springs Reservation, Arkansas, Platte National Park, Oklahoma. 1. From a hillside on the edge of the Ozark Mountains in central Arkansas issue springs of hot water which are effective in alleviation of rheumatic and kindred ills. Although chemical analysis fails to explain the reason, the practice of many years has abundantly proved their worth. Before the coming of the white man, they were known to the Indians, who are said to have proclaimed them neutral territory in time of war. Perhaps it was rumor of their fame upon which Ponce de Leon founded his dream of a fountain of youth. In the early years of the last century, hundreds of settlers toiled many miles over forest trails to camp beside them and bathe daily in their waters. The bent and suffering were carried there on stretchers. So many and so striking were the cures that the fame of these springs spread throughout the young nation, and in 1832, to prevent their falling into hands outstretched to seize and exploit them for private gain, Congress created them a national reservation. The Hot Springs Reservation was our first national park. Previous to this, a couple of log houses built by visitors served for shelter for the pilgrims at the Shrine of Health. Soon after, other buildings quite as primitive were erected. A road was constructed through the forest from the settled portions of the state, and many drove laboriously in with tents and camping outfits. I have seen a copy of a photograph, which was taken when photographs were new, showing several men and women in the odd conventional costume of that period, sitting solemnly upon the banks of a steaming spring, their clothes drawn up, their bare legs calf-deep in the hot water. Once started, hot springs grew rapidly. Unfortunately, this first act of national conservation failed to foresee the great future of these springs, and the reservation line was drawn so that it barely enclosed the brook of steaming vapors which was their outlet. Today, when the nation contemplates spending millions to beautify the national spa, it finds the city built solidly opposite. Railroads soon pushed their way through the Ozark foothills and landed thousands yearly beside the healing waters. Hotels became larger and more numerous. The government built a public bathhouse into which the waters were piped for the free treatment of the people. Concessioners built more elaborate structures within the reservation to accommodate those who preferred to pay for pleasanter surroundings or for private treatment. The village became a town, and the town a city. Boarding houses sprang up everywhere, with accommodations to suit the needs of purses of all lengths. Finally, large and costly hotels were built for the prosperous and fashionable, who began to find rare enjoyment in the beautiful Ozark country while they drank their hot water and took their invigorating baths. Hot Springs became a national resort. It will be seen that, in its way, Hot Springs has reflected the social development of the country. It has passed through the various stages that marked the national growth in taste and morals. During the period when gambling was a national vice, it was noted for its high play, and then gamblers of all social grades looked forward to their season in the South. During the period of national dissipation, when polite drunkenness was a badge of class, and New Year's Day an orgy, it became the periodic resort of inebriates. Just as later, with the elevation of the national moral sense, it became instead the most conservative of resorts, the periodic refuge of thousands of work-worn business and professional men seeking the astonishing recuperative power of its water. True again to the spirit of the times, Hot Springs reflects to the full the spirit of today. It is a southern mountain resort of quiet charm and wonderful natural beauty, set on the edge of a broad region of hills, ravines, and sweet-smelling pines, a paradise for the walker, the hiker, and the horseback rider. Down on the street, a long row of handsome modern bathhouses, equipped with all the scientific luxuries, and more besides, of the most elaborate European spa, concentrates the business of bath and cure. Back of this rise directly the beautiful Ozark Hills. One may have exactly what he wishes at Hot Springs. He may live with the sick, if that is his bent, or he may spend weeks of rich enjoyment of the South in holiday mood, and have his baths besides, without a suggestion of the sanitarium or even of the spa. Meantime, the mystery of the water's potency seems to have been solved. It is not chemical in solution which clears the system of its ills and restores the jaded tissues to buoyancy, but the newly discovered principle of radioactivity. Somewhere deep in nature's laboratory, these waters become charged with an uplifting power which is imparted to those who bathe according to the rules which many years of experience have prescribed. Many physicians refuse to verify the water's virtues. Some openly scoff. But the fact stands that every year hundreds who come helpless cripples walk jauntily to the station on their departure, and many thousands of sufferers from the rheumatic ills and the wear and tear of strenuous living return to their homes restored. I myself can testify to the surprising recuperative effect of only half a dozen daily baths, and I know businessmen who habitually go there whenever the stress of overwork demands measures of quick relief. It is not surprising that more than 100,000 persons visit hot springs every year. The recognized season begins after the winter holidays. Then it is that gaiety and pleasuring, riding, driving, motoring, golfing, and the social life of the fashionable hotels reach their height. But for sheer enjoyment of the quieter kind, the spring, early summer, and the autumn are unsurpassed. South though it lies, Hot Springs is delightful, even in midsummer. 2 railroads land the visitor almost at the entrance of the reservation. A fine road brings the motorist 60 miles from the lively city of Little Rock. The elaborate bathhouses line the reservation side of the principal street, opposite the brick city. But back of them rises abruptly the beautiful forested mountain, from whose side gush the healing waters, and back of this roll the beautiful pine-grown Ozarks. The division is sharply drawn. He who chooses may forget the city except at the hour of his daily bath. The plans for realizing in stone and landscape gardening the ideal of the great American spa, which this spot is in fact, contemplate the work of years. 2. In southern Oklahoma, not far from the Texas boundary, a group of 30 healing springs, those of cold, sparkling water, were set apart by Congress in 1904 under the title of the Platte National Park. Most of them are sulfur springs. Others are impregnated with bromides and other mineral salts. Many thousands visit yearly the prosperous bordering city of Sulphur to drink these waters. Many camp in or near the reservation. The bottled waters bring relief to thousands at home. Through the national park, from its source in the east to its entry into Rock Creek, winds Travertine Creek, the outlet of most of these springs. Rock Creek outlines the park's western boundary, and on its farther bank lies the city. Springs of importance within the park pour their waters directly into its current. All these Platte springs, like those of Hot Springs, Arkansas, were known to the Indians for their curative properties for many generations before the coming of the white settler. The park is the center of a region of novelty and charm for the visitor from the north and east. The intimate communion of prairie and rich forested valley, the sophistication of the bustling little city, in contrast with the rough life of the outlying ranches, the mingling in common intercourse of such differing human elements as the eastern tourist, the free and easy western townsman, the cowboy and the Indian, give rare spice to a visit long enough to impart the spirit of a country of so many kinds of appeal. The climate, too, contributes to enjoyment. The long spring lasts from February to June. During the short summer, social life is at its height. The fall lingers to the holidays before it gives way to a short winter, which the Arbuckle Mountains soften by diverting the colder winds. The pleasures are those of prairie and valley. It is a great land for riding. There is swimming, rowing, and excellent black bass fishing in the larger lakes. It is a region of deer and many birds. Its altitude is about 1,000 feet. The rolling Oklahoma Plateau attains in this neighborhood its pleasantest outline and variety. Broad plains of grazing land alternate with bare rocky heights and low mountains. The creeks and rivers which accumulate the waters of the springs, scattered widely among these prairie hills, are outlined by winding forested belts and flowered thickets of brush. Great areas of thin prairie yield here and there to rounded hills, some of which bear upon their summits columns of flat rocks heaped one upon the other, high enough to be seen for miles against the low horizon. These, which are known as the Chimney Hills, for many years have been a cause of speculation among the settlers who have nearly replaced the Indians since the state of Oklahoma replaced the Indian Territory, with which we became familiar in the geographies of earlier days. Who were the builders of these chimneys, and what was their purpose? At a hearing in Ardmore a few years ago, before a United States court taking testimony upon some ancient Indian depredation claims, writes Colonel R. A. Sneed, for years the superintendent of the Platte National Park, Practically all the residents of the Chickasaw Nation, Indian and Negro, whose memories of that country extend back 50 years or more, were in attendance. In recounting his recollections of a Comanche raid in which his master's horses were stolen, one old Negro incidentally gave a solution of the Chimney Hills, which is the only one the writer ever heard, and which probably accounts for all of them. He said that his master lived at Big Sulphur Springs, farthest west of any of the Chickasaws, that the Kiowas and Comanches raided the country every summer and drove out horses or cattle wherever they could find them unprotected, that he had often gone with his master to find these stolen cattle, that these forages were so frequent that the Chickasaws had never undertaken to occupy any of their lands west of Rock Creek, north of Big Sulphur Springs, nor west of the Washita River, south of the springs, that the country west of Sulphur Springs was dry, and water was hard to find unless one knew just where to look, and that the Comanches had a custom of marking all the springs they could find by building rock chimneys on the hills nearest to the spring. Only one chimney would be built if the spring flowed from beneath the same hill, but if the spring was distant from the hill, 2 chimneys would be built, either upon the same hill or upon 2 distant hills, and a sight along the 2 chimneys would indicate a course toward the spring. The old man said that every hill in their pasture land had a Comanche chimney on it, and that his master would not disturb them because he did not want to make the wild Indians mad. There never was open war between Chickasaws and the Comanches, but individual Chickasaws often had trouble with Comanche hunting parties. The Big Sulphur Springs on Rock Creek in the Chickasaw Nation afterward became the center around which the city of Sulphur was built, and after the town was grown to a population of 2,000 or more, it was removed bodily to make room for the Platte National Park, around which has been built the new city of Sulphur, which now has a population of 4,500. Many of the Comanche monuments are extant, and the great bluff above the Bromide Springs of the national park looks out toward the north and west over a prairie that extends to the Rocky Mountains. The monument that stood on the brow of that bluff must have been visible for many miles to the keen vision of the Comanche who knew how to look for it. The Indian Territory became the state of Oklahoma in 1907. The story of the white man's peaceful invasion is one of absorbing interest. The human spectacle of today is complex, even kaleidoscopic. In the 30s and 40s, the government had established in the territory 5 civilized Indian nations, the Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creeks, and Seminoles, each with its allotted boundaries, its native government, its legislatures, and its courts. In many respects, these were foreign nations within our boundaries. Besides them, the Osage Indians had their reservation in the north, and fragments of no less than 17 other tribes lived on assigned territory. Gradually, white men invaded the land, purchased holdings from the Indian nations, built cities, established businesses of many kinds, ran railroads in all directions. In time, the nations were abolished, and the remaining lands were divided up among the individuals composing them. The Indians of these nations became American citizens. Their Negro slaves, for they had been large slaveholders, received each his portion of the divided land. Then came Oklahoma. Today there is only one Indian reservation in the state, that of the Osages. Oil has been found on their land, and they are the wealthiest people in the world today, the average cash income of each exceeding $5,000 a year. In a state with a total population of 2.25 millions, live 336,000 Indians, representing 23 tribes, and 110,000 Negroes descended from slaves. There has been much intermarrying between Indians and whites, and some between Indians and blacks. Here is a mixture of races to baffle the keenest eye. Elsewhere than in the Osage Reservation, wealth has also come to the Indians. Many have very large incomes, large even for the rich of our eastern cities. Asphalt also has enriched many. Cotton is raised extensively in the southern counties. Grazing on a large scale has proved profitable. Many Indians own costly and luxurious homes, ride in automobiles, and enter importantly into business, politics, and the professions. These usually have more or less white blood. Many full-bloods, who have grown rich without effort, possess finely furnished bedrooms and sleep on the floor in blankets, elaborate dining rooms with costly table equipments, and eat cross-legged on the kitchen floor, gas ranges, and cook over chip fires out of doors, automobiles, and ride blanketed ponies. Many wealthy men are deeply in debt, because of useless luxuries which they have been persuaded to buy. Platte National Park lies about the center of what was once the Chickasaw Nation. It is a grazing and a cotton country. There are thousands of Indians, many of them substantial citizens, some men of local influence. Native dress is seldom seen. Quoting again from my correspondence with Colonel Sneed, here is the legend of the last of the Delawares. Along about 1840, a very few years after the Chickasaws and Choctaws had arrived in Indian Territory, a small band of about 60 Delaware Indians arrived in the territory, having roved from Alabama through Mississippi and Missouri, and through the northwest portion of Arkansas. Being a small band, they decided to link their fortunes with those of some of the other tribe of Indians, and they first pitched their teepees with those of the Cherokees. But the Cherokee chief, an old chief Wapanuka of the Delawares, did not agree. So the little band of Delawares continued rambling until they reached the Choctaw Nation, where they again tried to make terms with the chief of the tribe. Evidently no agreement was reached between that chief and Wapanuka, for the Delawares continued their roving until they reached the Chickasaw Nation, where they remained. Old Chief Wapanuka had a beautiful daughter whose name was Deerface. Two of the Delaware braves were very much in love with her, but Deerface could not decide which one of these warriors she should take to become chief after the death of Wapanuka. Chief Wapanuka called the two warriors before him, and a powwow was agreed upon. The council was held around the Council Rocks, which is now a point of interest within the Platte National Park, and a decision was reached to the effect that at a certain designated time the Delawares should all assemble on the top of the Bromide Cliff, at the foot of which flow the now famous Bromide and Medicine Springs, and that the two braves should ride their Indian ponies to the edge of the cliff, which was at that time known as Medicine Bluff, and jump off to the bed of the creek about 200 feet below. The one who survived was to marry Deerface and succeed Wapanuka as chief of the Delawares. The race was run, and both Indian braves made the jump from the bluff, but both were killed. When Deerface saw this, she threw herself from the bluff and died at the foot of the cliff where her lovers had met their death. Today her image may be seen, indelibly fixed on one of the rocks of the cliff where she fell, and the water of the Medicine Spring is supposed to be the briny tears of the old chief when he saw the havoc his decision had wrought. These tears, filtering down through the cliff where the old chief stood, are credited with being so purified that the water of the spring which they form is possessed with remedial qualities which make it a cure for all human ailments. End of Part 22. Part 23 of the Book of the National Parks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Book of the National Parks by Robert Sterling Yard. The Grand Canyon and Our National Monuments. On the Scenery of the Southwest. To most Americans, the Southwest means the desert, and it is true that most of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, and portions of Colorado and Southern California are arid or semi-arid lands, relieved, however, by regions of fertility and agricultural prosperity. In popular conception, the desert has been the negative of all that means beauty, richness, and sublimity, and it has been the synonym of poverty and death. Gradually, but surely, the American public is learning that, again, popular conception is wrong, that the desert is as positive a factor in scenery as the mountain, that it has its own glowing beauty, its own intense personality, and occasionally, in its own amazing way, a sublimity as gorgeous, as compelling, and as emotion-provoking as the most stupendous snow-capped range. The American desert region includes some of the world's greatest scenery. The Grand Canyon of the Colorado River is sunk in a plateau which, while sprinkled with scant pine, is nearly rainless. Zion Canyon is a palette of brilliant color lying among golden sands. A score of national monuments conserve large natural bridges, forests of petrified trees, interesting volcanic or other phenomena of prehistoric times, areas of strange cactus growths, deposits of the bones of monstrous reptiles, and remains of a civilization which preceded the discovery of America, and, in addition to these, innumerable places of remarkable magnificence as yet unknown except to the geologist, the topographer, the miner, the Indian, and the adventurer in unfrequented lands. This arid country consists of rolling, sandy plains as broad as seas, dotted with gray sagebrush and relieved by bare, craggy monadnocks and naked ranges which the rising and the setting sun paints unbelievable colors. Here and there thin growths of cottonwood outline thin ribbons of rivers, few and far between. Here and there alkali whitens the edges of stained hollows where water lies a while after spring cloudbursts. Here and there are salt ponds with no outlet. Yet even in the desolation of its tawny monotony, it has a fascination which is insistent and cumulative. But the Southwest is not all desert. There are great areas of thin grazing ranges and lands where dry farming yields fair crops. There are valleys which produce fruits and grains in abundance. There are hamlets and villages and cities which are among the oldest in America, centers of fertile tracts surrounded by deserts which need only water to become the richest lands on the continent. There are regions reclaimed by irrigation where farming has brought prosperity. In other places, the plateau covers itself for hundreds of square miles with scrubby pine and cedar. All in all, it is a land of rare charm and infinite variety. To appreciate a region which more and more will enter into American consciousness and divide travel with the mountains, the reader should know something of its structural history. The southwestern part of the United States rose above sea level and sank below it many times during the many thousands of centuries preceding its present state, which is that of a sandy and generally desert plateau, 5,000 to 10,000 feet in altitude. How many times it repeated this cycle is not fully known. Some portions of it, doubtless, were submerged oftener than others. Some were lifting while others were lowering. And meantime, mountains rose and were carried away by erosion to give place to other mountains, which also wore away. River systems formed and disappeared. Lakes and inland seas existed and ceased to exist. The history of our Southwest would have been tempestuous, indeed, had it been compassed within, say, the life of one man. But, spread over a period of time inconceivable to man, there may have been no time when it might have seemed to be more active in change than its still hot deserts seem today to the traveler in passing trains. Other parts of the continent, no doubt, have undergone as many changes. Our Southwest is not singular in that. But nowhere else, perhaps, has the change left evidences so plain and so interesting to the unscientific observer. The page of Earth's history is more easily read upon the bare deserts of our Southwest than on the grass-concealed prairies of the Mississippi Valley or the eroded and forested ranges of the Appalachians. Before the Rockies and the Sierra even existed, in the shallow sea which covered this part of the continent were deposited the ooze which later, when this region rose above the sea, became the magnificent limestones of the Grand Canyon. Muds accumulated which today are seen in many highly colored shales. Long ages of erosion from outlying mountain regions spread it thick with gravels and sands which now appear in rocky walls of deep canyons. A vast plain was built up and graded by these deposits. The trunks of trees washed down by the floods from far distant uplands were buried in these muds and sands, where, in the course of unnumbered centuries, they turned to stone. They are the petrified forests of today. Mountains, predecessors of our modern Sierra, lifted in the south and west, squeezed the moisture from the Pacific winds, and turned the region into desert. This was in the Jurassic period. Sands thousands of feet deep were accumulated by the desert winds, which are today the sandstones of the great walls of Zion Canyon. But this was not the last desert, for again the region sank below the sea. Again, for 500,000 years or more, ooze settled upon the sands to turn to limestone millions of years later. In this Jurassic Sea sported enormous marine monsters whose bones settled to the bottom to be unearthed in our times, and great flying reptiles crossed its water. Again the region approached sea level and accumulated, above its new limestones, other beds of sands. New river systems formed and brought other accumulations from distant highlands. It was then a low swampy plain of enormous size, whose northern limits reached Montana, and which touched what is now Kansas on its east. Upon the borders of its swamps, in Cretaceous times, lived gigantic reptiles, the dinosaurs and their ungainly companions, whose bones are found today in several places. For the last time the region sank, and a shallow sea swept from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean. Again new limestones formed, and as the surface very slowly rose for the last time at the close of the Cretaceous period, many new deposits were added to the scenic exhibit of today. Meantime, other startling changes were making, which extended over a lapse of time which human mind cannot grasp. Responding to increasing pressures from below, the continent was folding from north to south. The miracle of the making of the Rockies was enacting. During all of Tertiary times, earth movements of tremendous energy rocked and folded the crust and hastened change. The modern Sierra rose upon the eroded ruins of its predecessor, again shutting off the moisture-laden western winds and turning the southwest again into a desert. One of the mountain-building impulses spread eastward from the Sierra to the Wasatch Mountains, but nature's project for this vast granite-cored tableland never was realized, for continually its central sections caved and fell. And so it happened that the eastern edge of the Sierra and the western edge of the Wasatch Mountains became the precipitous edges, thousands of feet high, of a mountain-studded desert which today is called the Great Basin. It includes southeastern Oregon, nearly all of Nevada, the western half of Utah, and a large area in the south of California, besides parts of Idaho and Wyoming. It is 880 miles north and south and 572 miles wide. Its elevation is 5,000 feet, more or less, and its area more than 200,000 square miles. This enormous bowl contained no outlet to the sea, and the rivers which flowed into it from all its mountainous borders created a prehistoric lake with an area of 54,000 square miles, which was named Lake Bonneville after the Army officer whose adventures in 1833 were narrated by Washington Irving, but it was Fremont who first clearly described it. Lake Bonneville has evaporated and disappeared, but in its place are many salty lakes, the greatest of which is Great Salt Lake in Utah. Attenuated rivers still flow into the Great Basin, but are lost in their sands. The greatest of these, the Mojave River, is 100 miles long, but it is not often seen because it hides its waters chiefly under the surface sands. Lake Bonneville's prehistoric beaches exist today. Transcontinental passengers by rail cross its ancient bed, but few know it. The Great Basin today is known to travelers principally by the many lesser deserts which compose it, deserts separated from each other by lesser mountain ranges and low divides. Its southern and southeastern boundaries are the plateaus and mountains which form the northern watershed of the muddy Colorado River and its confluents. South of Colorado, the plateaus of New Mexico, Arizona, and Southern California gradually subside to the Rio Grande. During this period and the Quaternary which followed it, volcanoes appeared in many places. Their dead cones diversify our modern landscape. It was during the Quaternary period, in whose latter end lives man, that erosion dug the mighty canyons of our great Southwest. The Colorado was sweeping out the Grand Canyon at the same time that, far in the north, the glaciers of the Great Ice Age were carving from Algonquian shales and limestones the gorgeous cirques and valleys of Glacier National Park. End of Part 23. Part 24 of the Book of the National Parks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Book of the National Parks by Robert Sterling Yard. A Pageant of Creation. Grand Canyon National Park, Arizona. Area 958 square miles. There is only one Grand Canyon. It lies in northern Arizona, and the Colorado River, one of the greatest of American rivers, flows through its inner gorge. It must not be confused with the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, or with any of the Grande Cañons which the Spaniards so named because they were big canyons. The Grand Canyon is 217 miles long, 8 to 12 miles wide at the rim, and more than a mile deep. It is the colossus of canyons, by far the hugest example of stream erosion in the world. It is gorgeously colored. It is by common consent the most stupendous spectacle in the world. It may be conceived as a mountain range reversed. Could its molded image, similarly colored, stand upon the desert floor, it would be a spectacle second only to the vast mold itself. More than 100,000 persons visit the Grand Canyon each year. In other lands, it is our most celebrated scenic possession. It was made a national park in 1919. 1. The Grand Canyon is not of America, but of the world. Like the desert of the Sahara and the monster group of the Himalayas, it is so entirely the greatest example of its kind that it refuses limits. This is true of it also as a spectacle, far truer, in fact, for if it is possible to compare things so dissimilar, in this respect certainly it will lead all others. None will see it without being deeply moved, all to silence, some even to tears. It is charged to the rim with emotion, but the emotion of the first view varies. Some stand astounded at its vastness. Others are stupefied and search their souls in vain for definition. Some tremble. Some are uplifted with a sense of appalling beauty. For a time, the souls of all are naked in the presence. This reaction is apparent in the writings of those who have visited it. No other spectacle in America has inspired so large a literature. Joaquin Miller found it fearful, full of glory, full of God. Charles Dudley Warner pronounced it by far the most sublime of earthly spectacles. William Winter saw it as a pageant of ghastly desolation. Hamlin Garland found its lines chaotic and disturbing, but its combinations of color and shadow beautiful. Upon John Muir it bestowed a new sense of earth's beauty. Marius R. Campbell, whose geological researches have familiarized him with nature's scenic gamut, told me that his first day on the rim left him emotionally cold. It was not until he had lived with the spectacle that realization slowly dawned. I think this is the experience of very many, a fact which renders still more tragic a prevailing public assumption that the Grand Canyon is a one-day stop in a transcontinental journey. It is not surprising that wonder is deeply stirred by its vastness, its complexity, and the realization of nature's titanic labor in its making. It is far from strange that extreme elation sometimes follows upon a revelation so stupendous and different. That beauty so extraordinary should momentarily free emotion from control is natural enough. But why the expressions of repulsion not infrequently encountered upon the printed pages of the past? I have personally inquired of many of our own day without finding one, even among the most sensitive, whom it repelled. Perhaps a clue is discovered in the introductory paragraphs of an inspired word picture which the late Clarence E. Dutton hid in a technical geological paper of 1880. The lover of nature, he wrote, whose perceptions have been trained in the Alps, in Italy, Germany, or New England, in the Appalachians or Cordilleras, in Scotland or Colorado, would enter this strange region with a shock and dwell there with a sense of oppression and perhaps with horror. Whatsoever things he had learned to regard as beautiful and noble, he would seldom or never see, and whatsoever he might see would appear to him as anything but beautiful or noble. Whatsoever might be bold or striking would seem at first only grotesque. The colors would be the very ones he had learned to shun as tawdry or bizarre. The tones and shades, modest and tender, subdued yet rich, in which his fancy had always taken special delight, would be the ones which are conspicuously absent. I suspect that this revulsion, this horror, as several have called it, was born of the conventions of an earlier generation, which bound conceptions of taste and beauty, as of art, dress, religion, and human relations generally, in shackles which do not exist these days of individualism and broad horizons. Today we see the Grand Canyon with profound astonishment, but without prejudice. Its amazing size, its bewildering configuration, its unprecedented combinations of color affect the freed and elated consciousness of our times as another and perhaps an ultimate revelation in nature of law, order, and beauty. In these pages I shall make no attempt to describe the Grand Canyon. Nature has written her own description, graving it with a pen of water in rocks which run the series of the eternal ages. Her story can be read only in the original. Translations are futile. Here I shall try only to help a little in the reading. 2. The Grand Canyon was cut by one of the great rivers of the continent, the Colorado, which enters Arizona from the north and swings sharply west. Thence it turns south to form most of Arizona's western boundary, and a few miles over the Mexican border empties into the head of the Gulf of California. It drains 300,000 square miles of Arizona, Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. It is formed in Utah by the confluence of the Green and the Grand rivers. Including the greater of these, the Green River, it makes a stream 1,500 miles in length which collects the waters of the divide south and east of the Great Basin and of many ranges of the Rocky Mountain system. The Grand River, for its contribution, collects the drainage of the Rockies' mighty western slopes in Colorado. The lower reaches of these great tributaries, and practically all of the Colorado River itself, flow through more than 500 miles of canyons, which they were obliged to dig through the slowly upheaving sandstone plateaus in order to maintain their access to the sea. Succeeding canyons bear names designating their scenic or geologic character. Progressively southward, they score deeper into the strata of the Earth's crust until, as they approach their climax, They break through the bottom of the Paleozoic limestone deep into the heart of the Archean gneiss. This limestone trench is known as the Marble Canyon, the Archean Trench as the Granite Gorge. The lower part of the Marble Canyon and all the Granite Gorge, together with their broad, vividly colored and fantastically carved upper canyon 10 miles across from rim to rim, a mile high from water to rim level, the climax of the world of canyons, and the most gorgeous spectacle on earth, is the Grand Canyon of the Colorado. It lies east and west in the northern part of the state. To comprehend it, recall one of those ditches which we all have seen crossing level fields or bordering country roads. It is broad from rim to rim and deeply indented by the side washes which follow heavy showers. Its sides descend by terraces, steep in places with gentle slopes between the steeps, and on these slopes are elevations of rock or mud which floods have failed to wash away. Finally, in the middle, is the narrow trench which now, in dry weather, carries a small trickling stream. Not only does this ditch roughly typify the Grand Canyon, reproducing in clumsy, inefficient miniature the basic characteristics of its outline, but it also is identical in the process of its making. Imagining it in cross-section, we find its sides leading down by successive precipices to broad intermediate sloping surfaces. We find upon these broad surfaces enormous mesas and lofty, ornately carved edifices of rock which the floods have left standing. We find in its middle, winding snake-like from side to side, the narrow gorge of the river. The parallel goes further. It is not at all necessary to conceive that either the wayside ditch or the Grand Canyon was once brimful of madly dashing waters. On the contrary, neither may ever have held much greater streams than they hold today. In both cases, the power of the stream has been applied to downward trenching. The greater spreading sides were cut by the erosion of countless side streamlets resulting temporarily from periods of melting snow or of local rainfall. It was these streamlets which cut the side canyons and left standing between them the bold promontories of the rim. It was these streamlets, working from the surface, which separated portions of these promontories from the plateau and turned them into isolated mesas. It was the erosion of these mesas which turned many of them into the gigantic and fantastic temples and towers which rise from the canyon's bowl. Standing upon the rim and overlooking miles of these successive precipices and intermediate templed levels, we see the dark gorge of the Granite Trench, and deep within it, wherever its windings permit a view of its bottom, a narrow ribbon of brown river. This is the Colorado, a rill. But when we have descended 6,000 feet of altitude to its edge, we find it a rushing, turbulent torrent of muddy water. Its average width is 300 feet, its average depth 30 feet. It is industriously digging the Grand Canyon still deeper, and perhaps as rapidly as it ever dug since it entered the granite. Developing the thought in greater detail, let us glance at the illustrations of this chapter and at any photographs which may be at hand, and realization will begin. Let imagination dart back 1,000,000 years or more to the time when this foreground rim and that far run across the vast chasm are one continuous plain. Perhaps it is a pine forest, with the river, no greater than today, perhaps not so great, winding through it close to the surface level. As the river cuts downward, the spring floods following the winter snows cave in its banks here and there, forming sharply slanted valleys which enclose promontories between them. Spring succeeds spring, and these side valleys deepen and eat backward, while the promontories lengthen and grow. The harder strata resist the disintegration of alternate heat and cold, and while always receding, hold their form as cliffs. The softer strata between the cliffs crumbles, and the waste of spring waters spreads them out in long flattened slopes. The centuries pass. The ruin buries itself deep in the soft sandstone. The side valleys work miles back into the pine forest. Each valley acquires its own system of erosion. Into each, from either side, enter smaller valleys, which themselves are eating backward into the promontories. The great valley of the Colorado now has broad, converging, cliff-broken sides. Here and there these indentations meet far in the background behind the promontories, isolating island-like mesas. The rest of the story is simple repetition. Imagine enough thousands of centuries, and you will imagine the Grand Canyon. those myriad temples and castles and barbaric shrines, are all that the rains and melting snows have left of noble mesas, some of which, when originally isolated, enclosed, as the marble encloses the future statue, scores of the lesser but mighty structures which compose the wonder city of the depths. These architectural operations of nature may be seen today in midway stages. Find on the map the Powell Plateau in the northwest of the canyon. Once it was continuous with the rim, a noble promontory. It was cut out from the rim perhaps within the existence of the human race. A few 100,000 years from now, it will be one or more Aladdin palaces. Find on the map the Great Walhalla Plateau in the east of the canyon. Note that its base is nearly separated from the parental rim, 1,000 centuries or so, and its isolation will be complete. Not long after that, as geologists reckon length of time, it will divide into 2 plateaus. It is easy to pick the place of division. The tourist of 1,000,000 years hence will see, where now it stands, 100 glowing castles. Let us look again at our photographs, which now we can see with understanding. To realize the spectacle of the canyon, let imagination paint these strata their brilliant colors. It will not be difficult, but here again we must understand. It is well to recall that these strata were laid in the sea, and that they hardened into stone when the earth's skin was pushed thousands of feet in air. Originally, they were washings of distant highlands brought down by rivers. The coloring of the shales and sandstones is that of the parent rock modified, no doubt by chemical action in seawater. The limestone, product of the sea, is gray. As these differently colored strata were once continuous across the canyon, it follows that their sequence is practically identical on both sides of the canyon. That the colors seem confused is because, viewing the spectacle from an elevation, we see the enormous indentations of the opposite rim in broken and disorganized perspective. Few minds are patient and orderly enough to fully disentangle the kaleidoscopic disarray, but if we can identify the strata by form as well as color, we can at least comprehend without trouble our principal outline, and comprehension is the broad highway to appreciation. To identify these strata, it is necessary to call them by name. The names that geologists have assigned them have no scientific significance other than identity. They are Indian and local. Beginning at the canyon rim, we have a stalwart cliff of gray limestone known as the Kaibab limestone, or conversationally, the Kaibab. It is about 700 feet thick. Of this product of 1,000,000 years of microscopic life and death on sea bottoms is formed the splendid south rim cliffs from which we view the chasm. Across the canyon it is always recognizable as the rim. Below the talus of the Kaibab is the Coconino sandstone, light yellowish gray, coarse of grain, the product of swift currents of untold thousands of centuries ago. This stratum makes a fine bright cliff, usually about 400 feet in thickness, an effective roofing for the glowing reds of the depths. Immediately below the Coconino are the splendid red shales and sandstones known as the Supe Formation. These lie in many strata of varying shades, qualities, and thicknesses, but all, seen across the canyon, merging into a single enormous horizontal body of gorgeous red. The Supe measures 1,100 feet in perpendicular thickness, but as it is usually seen in slopes which sometimes are long and gentle, it presents to the eye a surface several times as broad. This is the most prominent single mass of color in the canyon, for not only does it form the broadest feature of the opposite wall and of the enormous promontories which jut therefrom, but the main bodies of Buddha, Zoroaster, and many others of the fantastic temples which rise from the floor. Below the Supe, a perpendicular wall of intense red, 500 feet high, forces its personality upon every foot of the canyon's vast length. It is the famous Red Wall, a gray limestone stained crimson with the drip of Supe dye from above. Harder than the sloping sandstone above and the shale below, it pushes aggressively into the picture, squared, perpendicular, glowing. It winds in and out of every bay and gulf, and fronts precipitously every flaring promontory. It roofs with overhanging eaves many a noble palace, and turns many a towering monument into a pagoda. Next below in series is the Tonto, a deep, broad, shallow slant of dull green and yellow shale, which, with the thin, broad sandstone base on which it rests, forms the floor of the outer canyon, the tessellated pavement of the City of Flame. Without the Tonto's green, the spectacle of the Grand Canyon would have missed its contrast and its fullness. Through this floor, the granite gorge winds its serpentine way, 2,000 feet deep, dark with shadows, shining in places where the river swings in view. These are the series of form and color. They occur with great regularity except in several spots deep in the canyon where small patches of gleaming quartzites and brilliant red shales show against the dark granite. The largest of these lies in the depths directly opposite El Tovar. These rocks are all that one sees of ancient Algonquian strata which once overlay the granite to a depth of 13,000 feet, more than twice the present total depth of the canyon. The erosion of many thousands of centuries wore them away before the rocks that now compose the floor, the temples and the precipiced walls of the Great Canyon, were even deposited in the sea as sand and limestone ooze, a fact that strikingly emphasizes the enormous age of this exhibit. Geologists speak of these splashes of Algonquian rocks as the Unkar group, another local Indian designation. There is also a similar Chuar group, which need not concern any except those who make a close study of the canyon. This is the picture. The imagination may realize a fleet, vivid impression from the photograph. The visitor upon the rim, outline in hand, may trace its twisting elements in a few moments of attentive observation, and thereafter enjoy his canyon as one only enjoys a new city when he has mastered its scheme and spirit, and can mentally classify its details as they pass before him. To one thus prepared, the Grand Canyon ceases to be the brewpot of chaotic emotion and becomes the orderly revelation of nature, the master craftsman, and the divine artist. End of Part 24. Part 25 of the Book of the National Parks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Book of the National Parks by Robert Sterling Yard. A Pageant of Creation continued. 3. Entrance is from the south. The motor road to Grandview is available for most of the year. The railroad to the El Tovar Hotel serves the year round, for the Grand Canyon is an all-year resort. There is a short winter of heavy snows on the rim, but not in the canyon, which may be descended at all seasons. Both routes terminate on the rim. Always dramatic, the Grand Canyon welcomes the pilgrim in the full panoply of its appalling glory. There is no waiting in the anteroom, no sounding of trumpets, no ceremony of presentation. He stands at once in the presence. Most visitors have bought tickets at home, which permit only one day's stay. The irrecoverable sensation of the first view is broken by the necessity for an immediate decision upon how to spend that day, for if one is to descend horseback to the river, he must engage his place and don his riding clothes at once. Under this stress, the majority elect to remain on the rim, for reasons wholly apart from any question of respective merit. After all, if only one day is possible, it is the wise decision. With the rim road, over which various drives are scheduled, and several commanding points to whose precipices one may walk, it will be a day to remember for a lifetime. One should not attempt too much in this one day. It is enough to sit in the presence of the spectacle. Fortunate is he who may stay another day and descend the trail into the streets of this vast city. Many times fortunate he who may live a little amid its glories. Because of this general habit of seeing the Grand Canyon between sunrise and sunset, the admirable hotel accommodations are not extensive, but sufficient. There are cottage accommodations also at cheaper rates. Hotels and cottages are well patronized summer and winter. Upon the rim are unique rest houses, in one of which is a high-power telescope. There is a memorial altar to John Wesley Powell, the first explorer of the canyon. There is an excellent reproduction of a Hopi house. There is an Indian camp. The day's wanderer upon the rim will not lack entertainment when his eyes turn for rest from the chasm. From the hotel, coaches make regular trips daily to various viewpoints. Hopi Point, Mojave Point, Yavapai Point, and Grandeur Point may all be visited. The run of 8 miles along the famous Hermit Rim Road permits brief stops at Hopi, Mojave, and Pima Points. Automobiles also make regular runs to the gorgeous spectacle from Grandview. Still more distant points may be made in private or hired cars. Navajo Point offers unequal views up and down the full length of the canyon, and an automobile road will bring the visitor within easy reach of Bass Camp near Havasupai Point in the far west of the reservation. Many one-day visitors take none of these stage and automobile trips, contented to dream the hours away upon Yavapai or Hopi Points nearby. After all, it is just as well. A single viewpoint cannot be mastered in one's first day, so what's the use of others? On the other hand, seeing the same view from different viewpoints miles apart will enrich and elaborate it. Besides, one should see many views in order to acquire some conception, however small, of the intricacy and grandeur of the canyon. Besides, these trips help to rest the eyes and mind. It is hard, indeed, to advise the unlucky one-day visitor. It is as if a dyspeptic would lead you to an elaborate banquet of a dozen courses and say, "I have permission to eat 3 bites. Please help me choose them." Wherever he stands upon the rim, the appalling silence hushes the voice to whispers. No cathedral imposes stillness so complete. It is sacrilege to speak, almost to move. And yet the Grand Canyon is a moving picture. It changes every moment. Always shadows are disappearing here, appearing there, shortening here, lengthening there. With every passing hour, it becomes a different thing. It is a sundial of monumental size. In the early morning, the light streams down the canyon from the east. Certain promontories shoot miles into the picture, gleaming in vivid color, backed by dark shadows. Certain palaces and temples stand in magnificent relief. The inner gorge is brilliantly outlined in certain places. As the day advances, these prominences shift positions. Some fade, some disappear, still others spring into view. As midday approaches, the shadows fade, the promontories flatten, the towering edifices move bodily backward and merge themselves in the opposite rim. There is a period of several hours when the whole canyon has become a solid wall. Strata fail to match, eye and mind become confused, comprehension is baffled by the tangle of disconnected bands of color, the watcher is distressed by an oppressive sense of helplessness. It is when afternoon is well advanced that the magician's sun begins his most astonishing miracles in the canyon's depths. Out of the blazing wall, one by one, step the mighty obelisks and palaces, defined by ever-changing shadows. Unsuspected promontories emerge. Undreamed-of gulfs sink back in the perspective. The serpentine gorge appears here, fades there, seems almost to move in the slow-changing shadows. I shall not try even to suggest the soul-uplifting spectacle which culminates in sunset. Days may be spent upon the rim in many forms of pleasure. Short camping trips may be made to distant points. The descent into the canyon is usually made from El Tovar down the Bright Angel Trail, so called because it faces the splendid Bright Angel Canyon of the north side, and by the newer Hermit Trail, which starts a few miles west. There are trails at Grandview, 8 miles east, and at Bass Camp, 24 miles west of El Tovar, which are seldom used now. All go to the bottom of the Granite Gorge. The commonly used trails may be traveled afoot by those physically able, and on muleback by any persons of any age who enjoys ordinary health. The Bright Angel trip returns the traveler to the rim at day's end. The Hermit Trail trip camps him overnight on the floor of the canyon at the base of a magic temple. The finest trip of all takes him down the Hermit Trail, gives him a night in the depths, and returns him to the rim by the Bright Angel Trail. Powell named Bright Angel Creek during that memorable first passage through the canyon. He had just named a muddy creek Dirty Devil, which suggested, by contrast, the name of Bright Angel for a stream so pure and sparkling. The Havasupai Indian Reservation may be visited in the depths of Cataract Canyon by following the trail from Bass Camp. The first experience usually noted in the descent is the fine quality of the trail, gentle in slope and bordered by rock on the steep side. The next experience is the disappearance of the straight, uncompromising horizon of the opposite rim, which is a distinctive feature of every view from above. As soon as the descent fairly begins, even the smaller bluffs and promontories assume towering proportions, and from the Tonto floor, the mighty elevations of Cheops, Isis, Zoroaster, Shiva, Wotan, and the countless other temples of the abyss become mountains of enormous height. From the river's side, the elevations of the Granite Gorge present a new series of precipitous towers, back of which in places loom the tops of the painted palaces, and back of them, from occasional favored view spots, the far distant rim. Here and here only does the Grand Canyon reveal the fullness of its meaning. 4. The Grand Canyon was discovered in 1540 by El Tovar, one of the captains of Cardenas, in charge of one of the expeditions of the Spanish explorer Diaz, who was hunting for 7 fabled cities of vast wealth. They reached the banks of a river which seemed to be more than 3 or 4 leagues above the stream that flowed between them. It was seen in 1776 by a Spanish priest who sought a crossing and found one at a point far above the canyon. This still bears the name Vado de los Padres. By 1840 it was probably known to the trappers who overran the country. In 1850, Lieutenant Whipple, surveying for a Pacific route, explored the Black Canyon and ascended the Grand Canyon to Diamond Creek. In 1857, Lieutenant Ives, sent by the War Department to test the navigability of the Colorado, ascended as far as the Virgin River in a steamboat, which he had shipped in pieces from Philadelphia. From there he entered the Grand Canyon afoot, climbed to the rim, and making a detour, encountered the river again higher up. In 1867, James White was picked up below the Virgin River, lashed to floating logs. He said that his hunting party, near the head of the Colorado River, attacked by Indians, had escaped upon a raft. This presently broke up in the rapids, and his companions were lost. He lashed himself to the wreckage and was washed through the Grand Canyon. About this time, Major John Wesley Powell, a schoolteacher who had lost an arm in the Civil War, determined to explore the great canyons of the Green and Colorado rivers. Besides the immense benefit to science, the expedition promised a great adventure. Many lives had been lost in these canyons, and wonderful were the tales told concerning them. Indians reported that huge cataracts were hidden in their depths, and that in one place the river swept through an underground passage. Nevertheless, with the financial backing of the State Institutions of Illinois and the Chicago Academy of Science, Powell got together a party of 10 men with 4 open boats, provisions for 10 months, and all necessary scientific instruments. He started above the canyons of the Green River on May 24, 1869. There are many canyons on the Green and Colorado rivers. They vary in length from 8 to 150 miles, with walls successively rising from 1,300 to 3,500 feet in height. The climax of all, the Grand Canyon, is 217 miles long, with walls 6,000 feet in height. On August 17th, when Powell and his adventurers reached the Grand Canyon, their rations had been reduced by upsets and other accidents to enough musty flour for 10 days, plenty of coffee, and a few dried apples. The bacon had spoiled. Most of the scientific instruments were in the bottom of the river. One boat was destroyed. The men were wet to the skin and unable to make a fire. In this plight they entered the Grand Canyon, somewhere in whose depths a great cataract had been reported. The story of the passage is too long to tell here. Chilled, hungry, and worn, they struggled through it. Often they were obliged to let their boats down steep rapids by ropes, and clamber after them along the slippery precipices. Often there was nothing to do but to climb into their boats and run down long foaming slants, around the corners of which death, perhaps, awaited. Many times they were upset and barely escaped with their lives. With no wraps or clothing that were not soaked with water, there were nights when they could not sleep for the cold. So the days passed, and the food lessened to a few handfuls of wet flour. The dangers increased. Some falls were 20 feet in height. Finally, 3 of the men determined to desert. They believed they could climb the walls, and that their chances would be better with the Indians than with the canyon. Powell endeavored to dissuade them, but they were firm. He offered to divide his flour with them, but this they refused. These men, 2 Howlands, brothers, and William Dunn, climbed the canyon walls and were killed by Indians. 2 or 3 days later, Powell and the rest of his party emerged below the Grand Canyon, where they found food and safety. Taught by the experience of this great adventure, Powell made a second trip 2 years later, which was a scientific achievement. Later on, he became director of the United States Geological Survey. Since then, the passage of the Grand Canyon has been made several times. R.B. Stanton made it in 1889 in the course of a survey for a proposed railroad through the canyon. One of the leaders of the party was drowned. 5. The history of the Grand Canyon has been industriously collected. It remains for others to gather the legends. It is enough here to quote from Powell the Indian story of its origin. Long ago, he writes, there was a great and wise chief who mourned the death of his wife and would not be comforted until Tavoats, one of the Indian gods, came to him and told him that his wife was in a happier land, and offered to take him there that he might see for himself, if upon his return he would cease to mourn. The great chief promised. Then Tavoats made a trail through the mountains that intervene between that beautiful land, the balmy region of the Great West, and this, the desert home of the poor Numa. This trail was the canyon gorge of the Colorado. Through it he led him, and when they had returned, the deity exacted from the chief a promise that he would tell no one of the trail. Then he rolled a river into the gorge, a mad, raging stream that should engulf any that might attempt to enter thereby. 6. The bill creating the Grand Canyon National Park passed Congress early in 1919 and was signed by President Wilson on February 26th. This closed an intermittent campaign of 33 years, begun by President Harrison, then Senator from Indiana, in January 1886, to make a national park of the most stupendous natural spectacle in the world. Politics, private interests, and the deliberation of governmental procedure were the causes of delay. A self-evident proposition from the beginning, it illustrates the enormous difficulties which confront those who labor to develop our national park system. The story is worth the telling. Senator Harrison's bill of 1886 met an instant response from the whole nation. It called for a national park 56 miles long and 69 miles wide. There was opposition from Arizona, and the bill failed. In 1893, the Grand Canyon National Forest was created. In 1898, depredations and unlawful seizures of land having been reported, the Secretary of the Interior directed the Land Office to prepare a new national park bill. In 1899, the Land Office reported that the bill could not be drawn until the region was surveyed. It took the Geological Survey 5 years to make the survey. The bill was not prepared because meantime it was discovered that the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, now the Santa Fe, owned rights which first must be eliminated. Failing to become a national park, President Roosevelt proclaimed the Grand Canyon a national monument in 1908. In 1909, a bill was introduced entitling Ralph H. Cameron to build a scenic railway along the canyon rim, which created much adverse criticism and failed. In 1910, the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society proposed a bill to create the Grand Canyon a national park of large size. The Geological Survey, to which it was referred, recommended a much smaller area. By the direction of President Taft, Senator Flint introduced a national park bill which differed from both suggestions. The opposition of grazing interests threw it into the hands of conferees. In 1911, Senator Flint introduced the conferees bill, but it was opposed by private interests and failed. Meantime, the country became aroused. Patriotic societies petitioned for a national park, and the National Federation of Women's Clubs began an agitation. The Department of the Interior prepared a map upon which to base a bill, and for several years negotiated with the Forest Service, which administered the Grand Canyon as a national monument, concerning boundaries. Finally, the boundaries were reduced to little more than the actual rim of the canyon, and a bill was prepared which Senator Ashurst introduced in February 1917. It failed in committee in the House owing to opposition from Arizona. It was the same bill, again introduced by Senator Ashurst in the new Congress 2 months later, which finally passed the House and became a law in 1919, but it required a favoring resolution by the Arizona legislature to pave the way. Meantime, many schemes were launched to utilize the Grand Canyon for private gain. It was plastered thickly with mining claims, though the Geological Survey showed that it contained no minerals worth mining. Mining claims helped delay. Schemers sought capital to utilize its waters for power. Railroads were projected. Plans were drawn to run sightseeing cars across it on wire cables. These were the interests, and many others, which opposed the national park. End of Part 25. Part 26 of the Book of the National Parks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Book of the National Parks by Robert Sterling Yard. The Rainbow of the Desert. Zion National Monument, southern Utah, area 120 square miles. When, in the 70s, Major J.W. Powell, the daring adventurer of the Grand Canyon, faced Salt Lake City on his return from one of his notable geological explorations of the Southwest, he laid his course by a temple of rock, lifting its opalescent shoulders against the eastern sky. His party first sighted it across 70 miles of a desert which rose in a series of cyclopean steps. When climbing these, they had seen the West Temple of the Virgin revealed in the glory of vermilion body and shining white dome, and had gazed between the glowing gates of Little Zion into the gorgeous valley within. These scenery-sated veterans of the Grand Canyon and the Painted Desert passed homeward profoundly impressed and planning quick return. No wonder that Brigham Young, who had visited it many years before with a party of Mormons seeking a refuge in event of Indian raids or of exile from their Zion, Salt Lake City, had looked upon its glory as prophetic and named it Little Zion. Geologists found the spot a fruitful field of study. They found it also a masterpiece of desert beauty. Again we are impressed with the marvelous beauty of outline, the infinite complication of these titanic buttes, wrote F.S. Dellenbaugh, topographer of the Powell party, on his second visit. It is doubtful if in this respect the valley has its equal. Not even the Grand Canyon offers a more varied spectacle, yet all is welded together in a superb ensemble. Nothing can exceed the wondrous beauty of Little Zion Canyon, wrote C.E. Dutton. In its proportions it is about equal to Yosemite, but in the nobility and beauty of its sculptures there is no comparison. It is Hyperion to a satyr. No wonder the fierce Mormon zealot who named it was reminded of the great Zion on which his fervid thoughts were bent, of houses not built with hands, eternal in the heavens. And Dr. G.K. Gilbert, whose intimate study of its recesses has become a geological classic, declared it the most wonderful defile that it had been even his experienced fortune to behold. Technical literature contains other outbursts of enthusiastic admiration, some of eloquence, hidden, however, among pages so incomprehensible to the average lover of the sublime in nature that the glory of Little Zion was lost in its very discovery. So remote did it lie from the usual lines of travel and traffic that though its importance resulted in its conservation as a national monument in 1909, it was 6 or 7 years more before its fame as a spectacle of the first order began to get about. The tales of adventurous explorers, as usual, were discounted. It was not until agencies seeking new tourist attractions sent parties to verify reports that the public gaze was centered upon the canyon's supreme loveliness. To picture Zion, one must recall that the great plateau in which the Virgin River has sunk these canyons was once enormously higher than now. The erosion of hundreds of thousands, or, if you please, millions of years, has cut down and still is cutting down the plateau. These cyclopean steps, each step the thickness of a stratum or a series of strata of hardened sands, mark progressive stages in the decomposition of the whole. Little Zion Canyon is an early stage in nature's process of leveling still another sandstone step. That is all. This one, fortunately, of many gorgeous hues. From the top of this layer we may look down thousands of vertical feet into the painted canyon whose river still is sweeping out the sands that nature chisels from the cliffs. Or from the canyon's bottom we may look up thousands of feet to the cliffed and serrated top of the doomed plateau. These ornate precipices were carved by trickling water and tireless winds. These fluted and towered temples of master decoration were disclosed when watery chisels cut away the sands that formerly had merged them with the ancient rock, just as the Lion of Lucerne was disclosed for the joy of the world when Thorwaldsen's chisel chipped away the alpine rock surrounding its unformed image. The colors are even more extraordinary than the forms. The celebrated Vermilion Cliff, which for more than 100 miles streaks the desert landscape with vivid red, here combines spectacularly with the White Cliff, another famous desert feature. 2,000 feet of the red surmounted by 1,000 feet of the white. These constitute the body of color. But there are other colors. The Vermilion Cliff rests upon the so-called Painted Desert stratum, 350 feet of a more insistent red relieved by mauve and purple shale. That in turn rests upon 100 feet of brown conglomerate streaked with gray, the grave of reptiles whose bones have survived 1,000,000 years or more. And that rests upon the greens and grays and yellows of the belted shales. Nor is this all, for far in the air above the wonderful white cliff rise in places 600 feet of drab shales and chocolate limestones intermixed with crimsons whose escaping dye drips in broad vertical streaks across the glistening white. And even above that, in places, lie remnants of the mottled, many-colored beds of St. Elmo's shales and limestones, in whose embrace, a few hundred miles away, lie embedded the bones of many monster dinosaurs of ages upon ages ago. Through these successive layers of sands and shales and limestones, the deposits of 1,000,000 years of Earth's evolution, colored like a Roman sash, glowing in the sun like a rainbow, the Virgin River has cut a vertical section, and out of its sides the rains of centuries have detached monster monoliths and temples of marvelous size and fantastic shape, upon whose many-angled surfaces water and wind have sculptured 10,000 fanciful designs and decorations. The way into this desert masterpiece of southern Utah is 100 miles of progressive preparation. From railroad to canyon there is not an unuseful mile or hour. It is as if all were planned, step by step, to make ready the mind of the traveler to receive the revelation with fullest comprehension. To one approaching who does not know the desert, the motion picture on the screen of the car window is exciting in its mystery. These vast arid bottomlands of prehistoric Lake Bonneville, girded by mountain groups and ranges as arid as the sands from which they lift their tawny sides, provoke suggestive questions of the past. In this receptive mood, the traveler reaches Lund and an automobile. The ride to Cedar City, where he spends the night, shows him the sage-dotted desert at close range. His horizon is one of bare, rugged mountains. In front of him rise the Cyclopean steppes, in long, irregular, deeply indented sweeps. The vivid pink cliff, which, had it not long since been washed away from Little Zion, would have added another tier of color to its top, here on the desert remains a distant horizon. The road climbs Lake Bonneville's southern shore, and at Cedar City reaches the glorified sandstones. From Cedar City to the canyon one sweeps through Mormon settlements founded more than 60 years ago, a region of stream-watered valleys known of old as Dixie. The road is part of the Arrowhead Trail, once in fact a historic trail, now a motor highway between Salt Lake and Los Angeles. The valleys bloom. Pomegranates, figs, peaches, apricots, melons, walnuts, and almonds reach a rare perfection. Cotton, which Brigham Young started here as an experiment in 1861, is still grown. Lusty cottonwood trees line the banks of the little rivers. Cedars dot the valleys and cover thickly the lower hills. And everywhere, on every side, the arid cliffs close in. The pink cliff has been left behind, but the vermilion cliff constantly appears. The white cliff enters and stays. Long stretches of road overlie one and another colored stratum. Presently the ground is prevailingly red, with here and there reaches of mauve, yellow, green, and pink. Cedar City proves to be a quaint, straggling Mormon village with a touch of modern enterprise. South of Cedar City the villages lack the enterprise. The houses are of a gray composition resembling adobe, and many of them are half a century old and more. The lapidated square forts, reminders of pioneer struggles with the Indians, are seen here and there. Compact Mormon churches are in every settlement, however small. The men are bearded, coatless, and wear baggy trousers, suggestive of Holland. Bronzed and deliberate women, who drive teams and work the fields with the men, wear old-fashioned sunbonnets. Many of these people have never seen a railroad train. Newspapers are scarce and long past date. Here Mormonism of the older fashion is a living religion, affecting the routine of daily life. Dixie is a land of plenty, but it is a foreign land. It is reminiscent, with many differences, of an Algerian oasis. The traveler is immensely interested. Somehow these strange primitive villages, these simple, earnest, God-fearing people, merge into unreality with the desert, the sage-dotted mountains, the cedar-covered slopes, the blooming valleys, the colored sands, and the vivid cliffs. Through Bellevue, Tocqueville, the ruins of Virgin City, Rockville, and finally to Springdale winds the road. Meantime, the traveler has speeded south under the Hurricane Cliff, which is the ragged edge left when all the land west of it sank 2,000 feet during some geologic time long past. He reaches the Virgin River where it emerges from the great cliffs, in whose recesses it is born, and whence it carries in its broad muddy surge the products of their steady disintegration. From here on, swinging easterly upstream, sensation hastens to its climax. Here the hurricane cliff sends aloft an impressive butte painted in slanting colors and capped with black basalt. Farther on, a rugged promontory striped with vivid tints pushes out from the southern wall nearly to the river's brink. The cliffs on both sides of the river are carved from the stratum which geologists call the belted shales. Greenish grays, brownish yellows, many shades of bright red are prominent. It is hard to name a color or shade which is not represented in its horizontal bands. The eye tires and the mind flags in their presence, writes Professor Willis T. Lee. To try to realize in an hour's time the beauty and variety of detail here presented is as useless as to try to grasp the thoughts expressed in whole rows of volumes by walking through a library. Far up the canyon which North Creek pushes through this banded cliff, two towering cones of glistening white are well named guardian angels of the stream which roars between their feet. Eagle Crag, which Moran painted, looms into view. On the south appears the majestic massing of needle-pointed towers which Powell named the pinnacles of the Virgin. The spectacular confuses with its brilliant variations. At the confluence of the Virgin River and its North Fork, known of old as the Parunaweap and the Mukuntuweap, the road sweeps northward up the Mukuntuweap. There have been differing reports of the meaning of this word, which gave the original name to the national monument. It has been popularly accepted as meaning Land of God, but John R. Wallace of St. George, Utah, has traced it to its original Indian source. Mukuntuweap, he writes, means Land of the Springs, and Parunaweap, Land of the Birds. Reaching Springdale at the base of the Vermilion Cliff, the traveler looks upstream to the valley mouth through which the river emerges from the cliffs, and a spectacle without parallel meets his eye. Left of the gorgeous entrance rises the unbelievable West Temple of the Virgin, and merging with it from behind loom the lofty towers of the Virgin. Opposite these, and back from the canyon's eastern brink, rises the loftier and even more majestic East Temple of the Virgin. Between them he sees a perspective of red and white walls, domes, and pinnacles which thrills him with expectation. And so, fully prepared in mind and spirit, awed and exultant, he enters Zion. Few natural objects which have been described so seldom have provoked such extravagant praise as the West Temple. It is seen from a foreground of gliding river, cottonwood groves, and talus slopes dotted with manzanita, sage, cedars, and blooming cactus. From a stairway of mingled yellows, reds, grays, mauves, purples, and chocolate brown, it springs abruptly 4,000 feet. Its body is a brilliant red. Its upper third is white. It has the mass and proportions, the dignity and grandeur of a cathedral. It is supremely difficult to realize that it was not designed, so true to human conception are the upright form and mass of its central structure, the proportioning and modeling of its extensive wings and buttresses. On top of the lofty central rectangle rests, above its glistening white, a low, squared cap of deepest red. It is a temple in the full, as well as the noblest sense of the word. The East Temple, which rises directly opposite and 2 miles back from the rim, is a fitting companion. It is 1,000 feet higher. Its central structure is a steep, truncated cone capped like the West Temple. Its wings are separated halfway down, one an elongated pyramid and the other a true cone, both of magnificent size and bulk, but truly proportioned to the central mass. Phrase does not convey the suggestion of architectural calculation in both of these stupendous monuments. One can easily believe that the Mormon prophet in naming them saw the design creations of a personal deity. A more definite conception of nature's gigantic processes follows upon realization that these lofty structures once joined across the canyon, stratum for stratum, color for color. The rock that joined them, disintegrated by the frosts and rains, has passed down the muddy current of the Virgin, down the surging tide of the Colorado, through the Grand Canyon, and into the Pacific. Some part of these sands doubtless helped to build the peninsula of Lower California. Passing the gates, the traveler stands in a trench of nearly perpendicular sides more than half a mile deep, half a mile wide at the bottom and a mile wide from crest to crest. The proportions and measurements suggest Yosemite, but there is little else in common. These walls blaze with color. On the west, the streaked wall, carved from the white cliff, is stained with the drip from the red and drab and chocolate shales and limestones, not yet wholly washed from its top. It is a vivid thing, wonderfully eroded. Opposite is the brown wall, rich in hue, supporting three stupendous structures of gorgeous color, two of which are known as the Mountain of the Sun and the Watchman. Together they are the Sentinels. Passing these across a plaza apparently broadened for their better presentation, rise on the west the three patriarchs, Yosemite-like in form, height, and bulk, but not in personality or color. The brilliance of this wonder spot passes description. Here the canyon contracts, and we come to the comfortable hotel camp, terminal of the automobile journey. It is on the riverside in a shady alcove of the east wall near a spring. Here horses may be had for exploration. A mile above the camp stands one of the most remarkable monoliths of the region. El Gobernador is a colossal truncated dome, red below and white above. The white crown is heavily marked in two directions, suggesting the web and woof of drapery. Directly opposite, a lesser monolith, nevertheless gigantic, is suggestively if sentimentally called Angel's Landing. A natural bridge, which is still in nature's workshop, is one of the interesting spectacles of this vicinity. Its splendid arch is fully formed, but the wall against which it rests its full length remains, broken through in one spot only. How many thousands or hundreds of thousands of years will be required to wipe away the wall and leave the bridge complete is for those to guess who will. Here also is the valley end of a wire cable which passes upward 2,500 feet to cross a break in the wall to a forest on the mesa's top. Lumber is Dixie's most hardly furnished need. For years, sawn timbers have been cabled down into the valley and carted to the villages of the Virgin River. In some respects, the most fascinating part of Little Zion is still beyond. A mile above El Gobernador, the river swings sharply west and doubles on itself. Raspberry Bend is far nobler than its name implies, and the great organ which the river here encircles exacts no imaginative effort. Beyond this, the canyon narrows rapidly. The road has long since stopped, and soon the trail stops. Presently the river, now a shrunken stream, concealing occasional quicksands, offers the only footing. The walls are no less lofty, no less richly colored, and the weary traveler works his difficult way forward. There will come a time, if he persists, when he may stand at the bottom of a chasm more than 2,000 feet deep, and nearly touching the walls on either side, look up and see no sky. At the water's edge the walls are perpendicular, writes Dr. G.K. Gilbert of the U.S. Geological Survey, who first described it, but in the deeper parts they open out toward the top. As we entered and found our outlook of sky contracted, as we had never before seen it between canyon cliffs, I measured the aperture above, and found it 35 degrees. We had thought this a minimum, but soon discovered our error. Nearer and nearer the walls approached, and our strip of blue narrowed down to 20 degrees, then 10, and at last was even intercepted by the overhanging rocks. There was, perhaps, no point from which, neither forward nor backward, could we discover a patch of sky, but many times our upward view was completely cut off by the interlocking of the walls, which, remaining nearly parallel to each other, warped in and out as they ascended. Here he surprises the secret of the making of Zion. As a monument of denudation, this chasm is an example of downward erosion by sand-bearing water. The principle on which the cutting depends is almost identical with that of the marble saw, but the sand grains, instead of being embedded in rigid iron, are carried by a flexible stream of water. By gravity they have been held against the bottom of the cut so that they should make it vertical, but the current has carried them in places against one side or the other, and so far modified the influence of gravity that the cut undulates somewhat in its vertical section as well as in its horizontal. This, then, is how nature began, on the original surface of the plateau, perhaps with the output of a spring shower, to dig this whole mighty spectacle for our enjoyment today. We may go further. We may imagine the beginning of the titanic process that dug the millions of chasms, big and little, contributing to the mighty Colorado, that dug the Grand Canyon itself, that reduced to the glorified thing it now is, the enormous plateau of our great Southwest, which would have been many thousands of feet higher than the highest pinnacle of Little Zion had not erosion more than counteracted the uplifting of the plateau. Little else need be said to complete this picture. The rains and melting snows of early spring produce mesa-top torrents which pour into the valley and hasten for a period the process of decorating the walls and leveling the plateau. So it happens that waterfalls of power and beauty then enrich this wondrous spectacle. But this added beauty is not for the tourist, who may come in comfort only after its disappearance. But springs are many. Trickling from various levels in the walls, they develop new tributary gorges. Gushing from the foundations, they create alcoves and grottos which are in sharp contrast with their desert environment, enriching by dampness the colors of the sandstone and decorating these refreshment places with trailing ferns and flowering growths. In these we see the origin of the Indian name Mukuntuweap, land of the springs. The Indians, however, always stood in awe of Little Zion. They entered it, but feared the night. In 1918, President Wilson changed the name from Mukuntuweap to Zion. At the same time, he greatly enlarged the reservation. Zion National Monument now includes a large area of great and varied desert magnificence, including the sources and canyons of 2 other streams besides Mukuntuweap. End of Part 26. Part 27 of the Book of the National Parks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Book of the National Parks by Robert Sterling Yard. Historic Monuments of the Southwest. 11 national monuments in the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado illustrate the history of our Southwest, from the times when prehistoric man dwelt in caves, hollowed in desert precipices, down through the Spanish fathers' centuries of self-sacrifice and the Spanish explorers' romantic search for the Quivira and the 7 cities of Cibola. The most striking feature of the absorbing story of the Spanish occupation is its twofold inspiration. Hand in hand, the priest and the soldier boldly invaded the desert. The passion of the priest was the saving of souls, and the motive of the soldier was the greed of gold. The priest deprecated the soldier despised the priest. Each used the other for the realization of his own purposes. The zealous priest, imposing his religion upon the shrinking Indian, did not hesitate to invoke the soldier's aid for so holy a purpose. The soldier used the gentle priest to cloak the greedy business of wringing wealth from the frugal native. Together they hastened civilization. Glancing for a moment still further back, the rapacious hordes already had gutted the rich stores of Central America and the northern regions of South America. The rush of the lustful conqueror was astonishingly swift. Columbus himself was as eager for gold as he was zealous for religion. From the discovery of America, scarcely 20 years elapsed before Spanish armies were violently plundering the Caribbean islands, ruthlessly subjugating Mexico, overrunning Venezuela, and eagerly seeking tidings of the reputed wealth of Peru. The air was supercharged with reports of treasure, and no reports were too wild for belief. Myths, big and little, ran amok. El Dorado, the gilded man of rumor, became the dream, then the belief of the times. Presently a whole nation was conceived clothed in dusted gold. The myth of the 7 cities of Cibola, each a city of vast treasure, the growth of years of rumor, seems to have perfected itself back home in Spain. The twice-born myth of Quivira, city of gold, which cost thousands of lives and hundreds of thousands of Spanish ducats, lives even today in remote neighborhoods of the Southwest. Pizarro conquered Peru in 1526. By 1535, with the south looted, Spanish eyes looked longingly northward. In 1539, Fray Marcos, a Franciscan, made a reconnaissance from the Spanish settlements of Sonora into Arizona with the particular purpose of locating the 7 cities. The following year, Coronado, at his own expense, made the most romantic exploration in human history. Spanish expectation may be measured by the cost of this and its accompanying expedition by sea to the Gulf of California, the combined equipment totaling $250,000 of American money of today. Coronado took 260 horsemen, 60 foot soldiers, and more than 1,000 Indians. Besides his pack animals, he led 1,000 spare horses to carry home the loot. He sought the 7 cities in Arizona and New Mexico, and found the pueblo of Zuni, prosperous but lacking its expected hoard of gold. He crossed Colorado in search of Quivira, and found it in Kansas, a wretched habitation of a shiftless tribe, their houses straw, he reported, their clothes the hides of cows, meaning bison. He entered Nebraska in search of the broad river whose shores were lined with gold, the identical year, curiously, in which De Soto discovered the Mississippi. Many were the pueblos he visited, and many his adventures and perils, but the only treasure he brought back was his record of exploration. This was the first of more than 2 centuries of Spanish expeditions. 50 years after Coronado, the myth of Quivira was born again. Thereafter it wandered homeless, the inspiration of constant search, and finally settled in the ancient pueblo of Tabirá, or as Bandelier has called it, Tepana, New Mexico. The myth of the 7 cities never wholly perished. It is not my purpose to follow the fascinating fortunes of Spanish proselyting and conquest. I merely set the stage for the tableau of the national monuments. 1. The Spaniards found our semi-arid southwest dotted thinly with the pueblos, and its canyons hung with the cliff dwellings of a large and fairly prosperous population of peace-loving Indians, who hunted the deer and the antelope, fished the rivers, and dry-farmed the mesas and valleys. Not so advanced in the arts of civilization as the people of the Mesa Verde in Colorado, nevertheless their sense of form was patent in their architecture, and their family life, government, and religion were highly organized. They were worshippers of the sun. Each pueblo and outlying village was a political unit. Let us first consider those national monuments which touch intimately the Spanish occupation. Gran Quivira National Monument. 80 miles southeast of Albuquerque, in the hollow of towering desert ranges, lies the arid country which Indian tradition calls the Accursed Lakes. Here, at the points of a large triangle, sprawl the ruins of 3 once flourishing pueblo cities, Abo, Cuari, and Tabirá. Once, says tradition, streams flowed into lakes inhabited by great fish, and the valleys bloomed. It was an unfaithful wife who brought down the curse of God. When the Spaniards came, these cities were at the flood tide of prosperity. Their combined population was large. Tabirá was chosen as the site of the mission whose priests should trudge the long desert trails and minister to all. Undoubtedly, it was one of the most important of the early Spanish missions. The greater of the 2 churches was built of limestone, its outer walls 6 feet thick. It was 140 feet long and 48 feet wide. The present height of the walls is 25 feet. The ancient community building adjoining the church, the main pueblo of Tabirá, has the outlines which are common to the prehistoric pueblos of the entire Southwest and persist in general features in modern Indian architecture. The rooms are 12 to 15 feet square, with ceilings 8 or 10 feet high. Doors connect the rooms, and the stories, of which there are 3, are connected by ladders through trapdoors. It probably held a population of 1,500. The pueblo has well stood the rack of time. The lesser buildings outside it have been reduced to mounds. The people who built and inhabited these cities of the Accursed Lakes were of the now extinct Piro stock. The towns were discovered in 1581 by Francisco Sanchez de Camascado. The first priest assigned to the field was Fray Francisco de San Miguel, this in 1598. The mission of Tabirá was founded by Francisco de Acevedo about 1628. The smaller church was built then. The great church was built in 1644, but was never fully finished. Between 1670 and 1675, all 3 native cities and their Spanish churches were wiped out by Apaches. Charles F. Lummis, from whom some of these historical facts are quoted, has been at great pains to trace the wanderings of the Quivira myth. Bandelier mentions an ancient New Mexican Indian called Tío Juan Largo, who told a Spanish explorer about the middle of the 18th century that Quivira was Tabirá. Otherwise, history is silent concerning the process by which the myth finally settled upon that historic city, far indeed from its authentic home in what is now Kansas. The fact stands, however, that as late as the latter half of the 18th century, the name Tabirá appeared on the official map of New Mexico. When and how this name was lost and the famous ruined city with its Spanish churches accepted as Gran Quivira perhaps never will be definitely known. Mid-ocean is not more lonesome than the plains, nor night so gloomy as that dumb sunlight, wrote Lummis in 1893, approaching the Gran Quivira across the desert. The brown grass is knee-deep, and even this shock gives a surprise in this hoof-obliterated land. The bands of antelope that drift, like cloud shadows, across the dun landscape suggest less of life than of the supernatural. The spell of the plains is a wondrous thing. At first it fascinates. Then it bewilders. At last it crushes. It is intangible, but resistless, stronger than hope, reason, will, stronger than humanity. When one cannot otherwise escape the plains, one takes refuge in madness. This is the setting of the ghost city of ashen hues, that wraith in pallid stone, the Gran Quivira. El Morro National Monument. Due west from Albuquerque, New Mexico, not far from the Arizona boundary, El Morro National Monument conserves a mesa end of striking beauty upon whose cliffs are graven many inscriptions cut in passing by the Spanish and American explorers of more than 2 centuries. It is a historical record of unique value, the only extant memoranda of several expeditions, an invaluable detail in the history of many. It has helped trace obscure courses and has established important departures. To the tourist it brings home, as nothing else can, the realization of these grim romances of other days. El Morro, the castle, is also called Inscription Rock. West of its steepled front, in the angle of a sharp bend in the mesa, is a large, partly enclosed natural chamber, a refuge in storm. A spring here betrays the reason for El Morro's popularity among the explorers of a semi-desert region. The old Zuni Trail bent from its course to touch this spring. Inscriptions are also found near the spring and on the outer side of the mesa facing the Zuni Road. For those acquainted with the story of Spanish exploration, this national monument will have unique interest. To all it imparts a fascinating sense of the romance of those early days with which the large body of Americans have yet to become familiar. The popular story of this romantic period of American history, its poetry and its fiction, remain to be written. The oldest inscription is dated February 18, 1526. The name of Juan de Onate, later founder of Santa Fe, is there under the date of 1606, the year of his visit to the mouth of the Colorado River. One of the latest Spanish inscriptions is that of Don Diego de Vargas, who in 1692 reconquered the Indians who rebelled against Spanish authority in 1680. The reservation also includes several important community houses of great antiquity, one of which perches safely upon the very top of El Morro Rock. Casa Grande National Monument. In the far south of Arizona, not many miles north of the boundary of Sonora, there stands, near the Gila River, the noble ruin which the Spaniards call Casa Grande, or Great House. It was a building of large size, situated in a compound of outlying buildings, enclosed in a rectangular wall. No less than 3 other similar compounds and 4 detached clan houses once stood in the near neighborhood. Evidently, in prehistoric days, this was an important center of population. Remains of an irrigation system are still visible. The builders of these prosperous communal dwellings were probably Pima Indians. The Indians living in the neighborhood today have traditions indicated by their own names for the Casa Grande, the Old House of the Chief, and the Old House of Chief Morning Green. The Pima word for green and blue is the same, Dr. Fuchs writes me. Russell translates the old chief's name, Morning Blue, which is the same as my Morning Green. I have no doubt Morning Glow is also correct, no doubt nearer the Indian idea, which refers to sun god. This chief was the son of the sun by a maid, as was also Chuhu Montezuma, a sun god, who, legends say, built Casa Grande. Whatever its origin, the community was already in ruins when the Spaniards first found it. Kino identified it as the ruin which Fray Marcos saw in 1539 and called Chichiltecalli, which Coronado passed in 1540. The early Spanish historians believed it an ancestral settlement of the Aztecs. Its formal discovery followed a century and a half later. Domingo Yiranza Petriz de Cruzate, governor of Sonora, had directed his nephew, Lieutenant Juan Mateo Monge, to conduct a group of missionaries into the desert, where Monge heard rumors from the natives of a fine group of ruins on the banks of a river which flowed west. He reported this to Father Eusebio Francisco Kino, the fearless and famous Jesuit missionary among the Indians from 1687 to 1711. In November 1694, Kino searched for the ruins, found them, and said Mass within the walls of the Casa Grande. This splendid ruin is built of a natural concrete called culeche. The external walls are rough, but are smoothly plastered within, showing the marks of human hands. 2 pairs of small holes in the walls opposite others in the central room have occasioned much speculation. 2 look east and west. The others, also on opposite walls, look north and south. Some persons conjecture that observations were made through them of the solstices, and perhaps of some star, to establish the seasons for these primitive people. The foundation for this unwarranted hypothesis, Dr. Fuchs writes, is probably a statement in a manuscript by Father Font in 1775 that the prince, chief of Casagrande, looked through openings in the east and west walls on the sun as it rose and set, to salute it. The openings should not be confused with smaller holes made in the walls for placing iron rods to support the walls by contractors when the ruin was repaired. Tumacacori National Monument. One of the best preserved ruins of one of the finest missions which Spanish priests established in the desert of the extreme south of Arizona is protected under the name of the Tumacacori National Monument. It is 57 miles south of Tucson, near the Mexican border. The outlying country probably possessed a large native population. The ruins are most impressive, consisting of the walls and tower of an old church building, the walls of a mortuary chapel at the north end of the church, and a surrounding court with adobe walls 6 feet high. These, like all the Spanish missions, were built by Indian converts under the direction of priests, for the Spanish invaders performed no manual labor. The walls of the church are 6 feet thick and plastered within. The belfry and the altar dome are of burned brick, the only example of brick construction among the early Spanish missions. There is a fine arched doorway. For many reasons, this splendid church is well worth a visit. It was founded and built about 1688 by Father Eusebio Francisco Quino, and was known as the Mission San Cayetano de Tumacacori. About 1769 the Franciscans assumed charge, and repaired and elaborated the structure. They maintained it for about 60 years, until the Apache Indians laid siege and finally captured it, driving out the priests and dispersing the Papagos. About 1850 it was found by Americans in its present condition. Navajo National Monument. The boundary line which divides Utah from Arizona divides the most gorgeous expression of the great American desert region. From the Mesa Verde National Park on the east to Zion National Monument on the west, from the natural bridges on the north to the Grand Canyon and the Painted Desert on the south, the country glows with golden sands and crimson mesas, a wilderness of amazing and impossible contours and indescribable charm. Within this region, in the extreme north of Arizona, lie the ruins of 3 neighboring pueblos. Richard Wetherill, who was one of the discoverers of the famous cliff cities of the Mesa Verde, was one of the party which found the Kit Seal, broken pottery ruin, in 1894, within a long crescent-shaped cave in the side of a glowing red sandstone cliff. In 1908, upon information given by a Navajo Indian, John Wetherill, Professor Byron Cumming, and Neil Judd located Betatakin, hillside house, ruin, within a crescent-shaped cavity in the side of a small red canyon. 20 miles west of Betatakin is a small ruin known as Inscription House, upon whose walls is a carved inscription supposed to have been made by Spanish explorers who visited them in 1661. While these ruins show no features materially differing from those of hundreds of other more accessible pueblo ruins, they possess quite extraordinary beauty because of their romantic location in cliffs of striking color in a region of mysterious charm. 2. But the Indian civilization of our Southwest began very many centuries before the arrival of the Spaniard, who found, besides the innumerable pueblos which were crowded with busy occupants, hundreds of pueblos which had been deserted by their builders, some of them for centuries, and which lay even then in ruins. The desertion of so many pueblos with abundant pottery and other evidences of active living is one of the mysteries of this prehistoric civilization. No doubt, with the failure of water supplies and other changing physical conditions, occasionally communities sought better living in other localities, but it is certain that many of these desertions resulted from the raids of the wandering, predatory tribes of the plains, the Querichos of Bandelier's records, but usually mentioned by him and others by the modern name of Apaches. These fierce bands continually sought to possess themselves of the stores of food and clothing to be found in the prosperous pueblos. The utmost cruelties of the Spanish invaders, who, after all, were ruthless only in pursuit of gold, and when this was lacking, tolerant and even kindly in their treatment of the natives, were nothing compared to the atrocities of these Apache Indians, who gloried in conquest. Of the ruins of pueblos which were not identified with Spanish occupation, 6 have been conserved as national monuments. The Bandelier National Monument. Many centuries before the coming of the Spaniards, a deep gorge on the eastern slope of the Sierra de los Valles, 18 miles west of Santa Fe, New Mexico, was the home of a people living in caves which they hollowed by enlarging erosional openings in the soft volcanic sides of nearly perpendicular cliffs. The work was done with pains and skill. A small entrance, sometimes from the valley floor, sometimes reached by ladder, opened into a roomy apartment, which in many cases consisted of several connecting rooms. These apartments were set in tiers or stories, as in a modern flat house. There were often 2, sometimes 3 floors. They occurred in groups, probably representing families or clans, and some of these groups numbered hundreds. Seen today, the cliffside suggests not so much the modern apartment house, of which it was in a way the prehistoric prototype, as a gigantic pigeon house. In time, these Indians emerged from the cliff and built a great semicircular pueblo up the valley, surrounded by smaller habitations. Other pueblos, probably still later in origin, were built upon surrounding mesas. All these habitations were abandoned perhaps centuries before the coming of the Spaniards. The gorge is known as the Rito de la Frijoles, which is the Spanish name of the clear mountain stream which flows through it. Since 1916, it has been known as the Bandelier National Monument, after the late Adolphe Francis Bandelier, the distinguished archaeologist of the Southwest. The valley is a place of beauty. It is 6 miles long and nowhere broader than half a mile. Its entrance scarcely admits 2 persons abreast. Its southern wall is the slope of a tumbled mesa, its northern wall the vertical cliff of white and yellowish pumice in which the caves were dug. The walls rise in crags and pinnacles many hundreds of feet. Willows, cottonwoods, cherries, and elders grow in thickets along the stream side, and cactus decorates the wastes. It is reached by automobile from Santa Fe. This national monument lies within a large irregular area which has been suggested for a national park because of the many interesting remains which it encloses. The Cliff Cities National Park, when it finally comes into existence, will include among its exhibits a considerable group of prehistoric shrines of great value and unusual popular interest. The Indians of today, writes William Boone Douglas, guard with great tenacity the secrets of their shrines. Even when the locations have been found, they will deny their existence, plead ignorance of their meaning, or refuse to discuss the subject in any form. Nevertheless, they claim direct descent from the prehistoric shrine builders, many of whose shrines are here found among others of later origin. Chaco Canyon National Monument. For 14 miles, both sides of a New Mexican canyon 65 miles equidistant from Farmington and Gallup are lined with the ruins of very large and prosperous colonies of prehistoric people. Most of the buildings were pueblos, many of them containing between 50 and 100 rooms. One, known today as Pueblo Bonito, must have contained 1,200 rooms. These ruins lie in their original desolation. Little excavation and no restoration has yet been done. Chaco Canyon must have been the center of a very large population. For miles in all directions, particularly westward, pueblos are grouped as suburbs group near cities of today. It is not surprising that so populous a desert neighborhood required extensive systems of irrigation. One of these is so well preserved that little more than the repair of a dam would be necessary to make it again effective. Montezuma Castle National Monument. Small though it is, Montezuma Castle is justly one of the most celebrated prehistoric ruins in America. Its charming proportions, and particularly its commanding position in the face of a lofty precipice, make it a spectacle never to be forgotten. It is 54 miles from Prescott, Arizona. This structure was a communal house which originally contained 25 rooms. The protection of the dry climate and of the shallow cave in which it stands has well preserved it these many centuries. Most of the rooms are in good condition. The timbers, which plainly show the hacking of the dull primeval stone axes, are among its most interesting exhibits. The building is crescent-shaped, 60 feet in width and about 50 feet high. It is 5 stories high, but the 5th story is invisible from the front because of the high stone wall of the facade. The cliff forms the back wall of the structure. Montezuma's castle is extremely old. Its material is soft calcareous stone, and nothing but its sheltered position could have preserved it. There are many ruined dwellings in the neighborhood. Tonto National Monument. 4 miles east of the Roosevelt Dam and 80 miles east of Phoenix, Arizona, are two small groups of cliff dwellings which together form the Tonto National Monument. The southern group occupies a cliff cavern 125 feet across. The masonry is above the average. The ceilings of the lower rooms are constructed of logs laid lengthwise, upon which a layer of fiber serves as the foundation for the 4-inch adobe floor of the chamber overhead. There are hundreds of cliff dwellings which exceed this in charm and interest, but its nearness to an attraction like the Roosevelt Dam and glimpses of it which the traveler catches as he speeds over the Apache Trail make it invaluable as a tourist exhibit. Thousands who are unable to undertake the long and often arduous journey by trail to the greater ruins can here get definite ideas and a hint of the real flavor of prehistoric civilization in America. Walnut Canyon National Monument. 30 cliff dwellings cling to the sides of picturesque Walnut Canyon, 8 miles from Flagstaff, Arizona. They are excellently preserved. The largest contains 8 rooms. The canyon possesses unusual beauty because of the thickets of locusts which fringe the trail down from the rim. One climbs down ladders to occasional ruins which otherwise are inaccessible. Because of its nearness to Flagstaff, several thousand persons visit this reservation yearly. Gila Cliffs National Monument. 50 miles northeast of Silver City, New Mexico, a deep, rough canyon in the west fork of the Gila River contains a group of 4 cliff dwellings in a fair state of preservation. They lie in cavities in the base of an overhanging cliff of grayish-yellow volcanic rock, which at one time apparently were closed by protecting walls. When discovered by prospectors and hunters about 1870, many sandals, baskets, spears, and cooking utensils were found strewn on the floors. Corncobs are all that vandals have left. End of Part 27. Part 28 of the Book of the National Parks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Book of the National Parks by Robert Sterling Yard. Desert Spectacles. The American desert, to eyes attuned, is charged with beauty. Few who see it from the car window find it attractive. Most travelers quickly lose interest in its repetitions and turn back to their novels. A little intimacy changes this attitude. Live a little with the desert. See it in its varied moods. For every hour it changes. See it at sunrise, at midday, at sunset, in the ghostly night, by moonlight. Observe its life, for it is full of life, its amazing vegetation, its varied outline. Drink in its atmosphere, its history, its tradition, its romance. Open your soul to its persuading spirit. Then, insensibly, but swiftly, its flavor will enthrall your senses. It will possess you. And once possessed, you are charmed for life. It will call you again and again, as the sea calls the sailor, and the East its devotees. This alluring region is represented in our national park system by reservations which display its range. The Zion National Monument, the Grand Canyon, and the Mesa Verde illustrate widely differing phases. The historical monuments convey a sense of its romance. There remain a few to complete the gamut of its charms. The Rainbow Bridge National Monument. Imagine a gray Navajo desert dotted with purple sage, huge mesas, deep red, squared against the gray-blue atmosphere of the horizon, pinnacles, spires, shapes like monstrous bloody fangs springing from the sands, a floor as rough as stormy seas, heaped with tumbled rocks, red, yellow, blue-green, grayish-white, between which rise strange yellowish-green thorny growths, cactus-like and unfamiliar, a pathless waste, strewn with obsidian fragments, glaring in the noon sun, more confusing than the crooked mazes of an ancient oriental city. Imagine shapeless masses of colored sandstone, unclimbable, barring the way, acres of polished mottled rock tilted at angles which defy crossing, unexpected canyons whose deep, broken, red and yellow precipices force long detours. And everywhere color, color, color. It pervades the glowing floor, the uprising edifices. The very air palpitates with color, insistent, irresistible, indefinable. This is the setting of the Rainbow Bridge. Scarcely more than 100 persons besides Indians, they tell me, have seen this most entrancing spectacle, perhaps of all America. The way in is long and difficult. There are only 2 or 3 who know it, even of those who have been there more than once, and the region has no inhabitants to point directions among the confusing rocks. There is no water, nor any friendly tree. The day's ride is wearying in the extreme, in spite of its fascinations. The objective is Navajo Mountain, which, strange spectacle in this desert waste, is forested to its summit, with yellow pine above a surrounding belt of juniper and pinyon, with aspen and willows, wild roses, Indian paintbrush, primrose, and clematis in its lower valleys. Below, the multicolored desert, deep cut with the canyons which carry off the many little rivers. Down one of these wild and highly colored desert canyons, among whose vivid tumbled rocks your horses pick their courses with difficulty, you suddenly see a rainbow caught among the vivid bald rocks, a slender arch so deliciously proportioned, so gracefully curved among its sharp surroundings, that your eye fixes it steadfastly and your heart bounds with relief. Until now you had not noticed the oppression of this angled, spine-carpeted landscape. From now on, nothing else possesses you. The eccentricity of the going constantly hides it, and each reappearance brings again the joy of discovery. And at last you reach it, dismount beside the small, clear stream which flows beneath it, approach reverently, overwhelmed with a strange mingling of awe and great elation. You stand beneath its enormous encircling red and yellow arch, and perceive that it is the support which holds up the sky. It is long before turbulent emotion permits the mind to analyze the elements which compose its extraordinary beauty. Dimensions mean little before spectacles like this. To know that the span is 278 feet may help realization at home, where it may be laid out, staked and looked at. It exceeds a block of Fifth Avenue in New York. To know that the apex of the rainbow's curve is 309 feet above your wondering eyes means nothing to you there, but to those who know New York City, it means the height of the Flatiron Building, built 3 stories higher. Choose a building of equal height in your own city. Stand beside it and look up. Then imagine a gigantic monolithic arch of entrancing proportions and fascinating curve, glowing in reds and yellows which merge into each other insensibly and without form or pattern. Imagine this fairy unreality outlined, not against the murk which overlies cities, but against a sky of desert clarity and color. All natural bridges are created wholly by erosion. This was carved from an outstanding spur of Navajo sandstone, which lay crosswise of the canyon. Originally the stream struck full against this barrier, swung sideways, and found its way around the spur's free outer edge. The end was merely a matter of time. Gradually but surely the stream, sand-laden in times of flood, wore an ever-deepening hollow in the barrier. Finally it wore it through, and passed under what then became a bridge. But meantime other agencies were at work. The rocky wall above, alternately hot and cold, as happens in high arid lands, detached curved, flattened plates. Worn below by the stream, thinned above by the destructive processes of wind and temperature, the window enlarged. In time, the Rainbow Bridge evolved in all its glorious beauty. Not far away is another natural bridge, well advanced in the making. The Rainbow Bridge was discovered in 1909 by William Boone Douglas, Examiner of Surveys in the General Land Office, Santa Fe. Following is an abstract of the government report covering the discovery. The information had come to Mr. Douglas from a Paiute Indian, Mike's boy, who later took the name of Jim. Employed as flagman in the survey of the 3 great natural bridges of White Canyon. Seeing the white man's appreciation of this form of wind and water erosion, Jim told of a greater bridge known only to himself and one other Indian, located in the north side of the Navajo Mountain, in the Paiute Indian Reservation. Bending a twig of willow in rainbow shape, with its end stuck in the ground, Jim showed what his bridge looked like. An effort was made to reach the bridge in December. Unfortunately, Jim could not be located. On reaching the Navajo trading post, Olyato, nothing was known of such a bridge, and the truth of Jim's statement was questioned. The trip was abandoned until August of the following year, when Mr. Douglas organized a second party at Bluff, Utah, and under Jim's guidance left for the bridge. At Oljato, the party was augmented by Professor Cummings and a party of college students, with John Wetherill as packer, who were excavating ruins in the Navajo Indian Reservation. As the uninhabited and unknown country of the bridge was reached, travel became almost impossible. All equipment, save what was absolutely indispensable, was discarded. The whole country was a maze of box canyons, as though some turbulent sea had suddenly solidified in rock. Only at a few favored points could the canyon walls be scaled even by man, and still fewer where a horse might clamber. In the sloping sandstone ledges, footholds for the horses must be cut, and even then they fell, until their loss seemed certain. After many adventures, the party arrived at 11:00 a.m., August 14, 1909. Jim had indeed made good. Silhouetted against a turquoise sky was an arch of rainbow shape, so delicately proportioned that it seemed as if some great sculptor had hewn it from the rock. Its span of 270 feet bridged a stream of clear, sparkling water that flowed 310 feet below its crest. The world's greatest natural bridge had been found, as Jim had described it. Beneath it, an ancient altar bore witness to the fact that it was a sacred shrine of those archaic people, the builders of the weird and mysterious cliff castles seen in the Navajo National Monument. The crest of the bridge was reached by Mr. Douglas and his 3 assistants, John R. English, Gene F. Rogerson, and Daniel Perkins, by lowering themselves with ropes to the south abutment and climbing its arch. Probably they were the first human beings to reach it. No Indian name for the bridge was known, except such descriptive generic terms as the Paiute, the space under a horse's belly between its fore and hind legs, or the hole in the rock, Nonnazoshi, of the Navajo, neither of which was deemed appropriate. While the question of a name was still being debated, there appeared in the sky, as if in answer, a beautiful rainbow, the Barahoni of the Paiutes. The suitability of the name was further demonstrated by a superstition of the Navajos. On the occasion of his second visit, the fall of the same year, Mr. Douglas had as an assistant an old Navajo Indian named Whitehorse, who, after passing under the bridge, would not return, but climbed laboriously around its end. On being pressed for an explanation, he would arch his hand, and through it squint at the sun, solemnly shaking his head. Later, through the assistance of Mrs. John Wetherill, an experienced Navajo linguist, Mr. Douglas learned that the formations of the type of the bridge were symbolic rainbows, or the sun's path, and one passing under could not return, under penalty of death, without the utterance of a certain prayer, which Whitehorse had forgotten. The aged Navajo informant would not reveal the prayer for fear of the lightning snake. If your return from Rainbow Bridge carries you through Monument Valley with its miles of blazing red structures, memory will file still another amazing sensation. Some of its crimson monsters rise 1,000 feet above the grassy plain. Natural Bridges National Monument. Not many miles north of the Rainbow Bridge, 50 miles from Monticello in southern Utah, in a region not greatly dissimilar in outline and only less colorful, 3 natural bridges of large size have been conserved under the title of the Natural Bridges National Monument. Here, west of the Mesa Verde, the country is characterized by long, broad mesas, sometimes crowned with stunted cedar forests, dropping suddenly into deep valleys. The erosion of many thousands of centuries has plowed the surface into winding rock-strewn canyons, great and small. 3 of these canyons are crossed by bridges stream-cut through the solid rock. The largest, locally known as the Augusta Bridge, is named Sipapu, Gate of Heaven. It is one of the largest natural bridges in the world, measuring 222 feet in height, with a span of 261 feet. It is a graceful and majestic structure, so proportioned and finished that it is difficult, from some points of view, to believe it the unplanned work of natural forces. One crosses it on a level platform 28 feet wide. The other 2, which are nearly its size, are found within 5 miles. The Kachina, which means guardian spirit, is locally called the Caroline Bridge. The Owachoma, meaning rock mound, is locally known as the Edwin Bridge. The local names celebrate persons who visited them soon after they were first discovered by Emery Knowles in 1895. They may be reached by horse and pack train from Monticello or Bluff, Utah. One of the 5 sections of the reservation conserves 2 large caves. Dinosaur National Monument. The Age of Reptile developed a wide variety of monsters in the central regions of the continent from Montana to the Gulf of Mexico. The dinosaurs of the Triassic and Jurassic periods sometimes had gigantic size, the Brontosaurus attaining a length of 60 feet or more. The femur of the Brachiosaurus exceeded 6 feet. This must have been the greatest of them all. The greatest dinosaurs were herbivorous. The carnivorous species were not remarkable for size. There were small leaping forms scarcely larger than rabbits. The necessity for defense against the flesh-eaters developed, in the smaller dinosaurs, extremely heavy armor. The stegosaur carried huge plates upon his curved back, suggesting a circular saw. His long, powerful tail was armed with sharp spikes, and must have been a dangerous weapon. Dinosaurs roamed all over what is now called our Middle West. In those days, the central part of our land was warm and swampy. Fresh-water lagoons and sluggish streams were bordered by low forests of palms and ferns. One must go to the tropics to find a corresponding landscape in our times. The waters abounded in reptiles and fish. Huge winged reptiles flew from cover to cover. The first birds were evolving from reptilian forms. The absorbing story of these times is written in the rocks. The life forms were at their full when the sands were laid which today is the widespread layer of sandstone which geologists call the Morrison Formation. Erosion has exposed this sandstone in several parts of the western United States, and many have been the interesting glimpses it has afforded of that strange period so many millions of years ago. In the Uinta Basin of northwest Utah, a region of badlands crossed by the Green River on its way to the Colorado and the Grand Canyon, the Morrison strata have been bent upward at an angle of 60 degrees or more, and then cut through, exposing their entire depth. The country is extremely rough and bare. Only in occasional, widely separated bottoms has irrigation made farming possible. Elsewhere, nothing grows upon the bald hillsides. Here, 18 miles west of the town of Vernal, 80 acres of the exposed Morrison strata were set aside in 1915 as the Dinosaur National Monument. These acres have already yielded a very large collection of skeletons. Since 1908, the Carnegie Museum of Pittsburgh has been gathering specimens of the greatest importance. The only complete skeleton of a dinosaur ever found was taken out in 1909. The work of quarrying and removal is done with the utmost care. The rock is chiseled away in thin layers, as no one can tell when an invaluable relic may be found. As fast as bones are detached, they are covered with plaster of Paris and so wrapped that breakage becomes impossible. 2 years were required to unearth the skeleton of a Brontosaurus. The extraordinary massing of fossil remains at this point suggests that floods may have swept these animals from a large area and lodged their bodies here, where they were covered with sands. But it is also possible that this spot was merely a favorite feeding ground. It may be that similarly rich deposits lie hidden in many places in the widespread Morrison sandstone, which someday may be unearthed. The bones of dinosaurs have been found in the Morrison of Colorado, near Boulder. Petrified Forest National Monument. For 125 or 30 miles southwest of the Grand Canyon, the valley of the Little Colorado River is known as the Painted Desert. It is a narrow plain of Carboniferous and Triassic marls, shales, sandstones, and conglomerates, abounding in fossils, the most arid part of Arizona. Even the river's lower reaches dry up for a part of each year. But it is a palette of brilliant colors. It will be difficult to name a tint or shade which is not vividly represented in this gaudy floor and in the strata of the cliffs which define its northern and eastern limits. Above and beyond these cliffs lies that other amazing desert, the Navajo country, the land of the Rainbow Bridge and the Canyon de Chelly. I have mentioned the Painted Desert because it is shaped like a long, narrow finger pointed straight at the petrified forests lying just beyond its touch. Here the country is also highly colored, but very differently. Maroon and tawny yellow are the prevailing tints of the marls, red and brown the colors of the sandstones. There is a rolling, sandy floor crisscrossed with canyons in whose bottoms grow stunted cedars and occasional cottonwoods. Upon this floor thousands of petrified logs are heaped in confusion. In many places the strong suggestion is that of a log jam left stranded by subsiding floods. Nearly all the logs have broken into short lengths as cleanly cut as if sawn, the result of succeeding heat and cold. Areas of petrified wood are common in many parts of the Navajo country and its surrounding deserts. The larger areas are marked on the geological survey maps, and many lesser areas are mentioned in reports. There are references to rooted stumps. The 3 groups in the Petrified Forest National Monument, near the town of Adamana, Arizona, were chosen for conservation because they are the largest and perhaps the finest. At the time, the gorgeously colored logs were being carried away in quantities to be cut up into tabletops. As a matter of fact, these are not forests. Most of these trees grew upon levels 700 feet or more higher than where they now lie and at unknown distances. Floods left them here. The first forest, which lies 6 miles south of Adamana, contains thousands of broken lengths. One unbroken log, 111 feet long, bridges a canyon 45 feet wide, a remarkable spectacle. In the second forest, which lies 2.5 miles south of that, and the third forest, which is 13 miles south of Adamana and 18 miles southeast of Holbrook, most of the trunks appear to lie in their original positions. One, which was measured by Dr. G. H. Knowlton of the Smithsonian Institution, was more than 7 feet in diameter and 120 feet long. He estimates the average diameters at 3 or 4 feet, while lengths vary from 60 to 100 feet. The coloring of the wood is variegated and brilliant. The state of mineralization in which most of this wood exists, writes Professor Lester F. Ward, paleobotanist, almost places them among the gems or precious stones. Not only are chalcedony, opals, and agates found among them, but many approach the condition of jasper and onyx. The chemistry of the process of petrification or silicification, writes Dr. George P. Merrill, curator of geology in the National Museum, is not quite clear. Silica is ordinarily looked upon as one of the most insoluble of substances. It is nevertheless readily soluble in alkaline solutions, that is, solutions containing soda or potash. It is probable that the solutions permeating these buried logs were thus alkaline, and as the logs gradually decayed, their organic matter was replaced, molecule by molecule, by silica. The brilliant red and other colors are due to the small amount of iron and manganese deposited together with the silica and superoxidized as the trunks are exposed to the air. The most brilliant colors are therefore to be found on the surface. The trees are of several species. All those identified by Dr. Knowlton were Araucaria, which do not now live in the northern hemisphere. Dr. E. C. Jeffrey of Harvard has described one genus unknown elsewhere. To get the petrified forest into full perspective, it is well to recall that these shales and sands were laid in water, above whose surface the land raised many times, only to sink again and accumulate new strata. The plateau now has 5,700 feet of altitude. When it is known, writes Dr. Knowlton, that since the close of Triassic times probably more than 50,000 feet of sediments have been deposited, it is seen that the age of the Triassic forests of Arizona can only be reckoned in millions of years. Just how many it would be mere speculation to attempt to estimate. It is certain, also, that at one time the strata containing these petrified logs were themselves buried beneath thousands of feet of strata of later ages, which have in places been worn away sufficiently to expose the tree-bearing beds. Undoubtedly other forests as great or greater than those now exposed lie buried beneath the later formations. A very interesting small forest, not in the reservation, lies 9 miles south of Adamana. Papago Saguaro National Monument. The popular idea of a desert of dry drifting sand, unrelieved except at occasional oases by evidences of life, was born of our early geographies, which pictured the Sahara as the desert type. Far different indeed is our American desert, most of which has a few inches of rainfall in the early spring, and grows a peculiar flora of remarkable individuality and beauty. The creosote bush, seen from the car windows, shelters a few grasses which brown and die by summer, but help to color the landscape the year round. Many low flowering plants gladden the desert springtime, and in the far south, and particularly in the far southwest, are several varieties of cactus which attain great size. The frequenter of the desert soon correlates its flora with its other scenic elements and finds all rich and beautiful. In southwestern Arizona and along the southern border of California, this strange flora finds its fullest expression. Here one enters a new fairyland, a region of stinging bushes and upstanding monsters lifting ungainly arms to heaven. In 1914, to conserve one of the many rich tracts of desert flora, President Wilson created the Papago-Saguaro National Monument a few miles east of Phoenix, Arizona. Its 2,050 acres include fine examples of innumerable desert species in fullest development. Amongst these, the kola is at once one of the most fascinating and the most exasperating. It belongs to the prickly pear family, but there resemblance ceases. It is a stocky bush 2 or 3 feet high, covered with balls of flattened, powerful, sharp-pointed needles, which will penetrate even a heavy shoe. In November these fall, strewing the ground with spiny, indestructible weapons. There are many varieties of kolas, and all are decorative. The tree kola grows from 7 to 10 feet in height, a splendid, showy feature of the desert slopes, and the home, fortress, and sure defense for all the birds who can find nest room beneath its bristling breastwork. The Cereus thurberi, the pipe organ, or candelabra cactus, as it is variously called, grows in thick, straight columns, often clumped close together, a picturesque and beautiful creation. Groups range from a few inches to many feet in height. One clump of 22 stems has been reported, the largest stem of which was 20 feet high and 22 inches in diameter. Another picturesque appeal is the bisnaga, or barrel cactus, of which there are many species of many sizes. Like all cacti, it absorbs water during the brief wet season and stores it for future use. A specimen the size of a flour barrel can be made to yield a couple of gallons of sweetish but refreshing water, whereby many a life has been saved in the sandy wastes. But the desert's chief exhibit is the giant saguaro, the Cereus giganteus, from which the reservation got its name. This stately cactus rises in splendid green column, accordion-plated and decorated with star-like clusters of spines upon the edges of the plates. The larger specimens grow as high as 60 or 70 feet and throw out at intervals powerful branches which bend sharply upward. Sometimes there are as many as 8 or 9 of these gigantic branches. No towering fir or spreading oak carries a more princely air. A forest of giant saguaro, rising from a painted desert far above the tangle of creosote bush, mesquite, kola, bisnaga, and scores of other strange growths of a land of strange attractions, is a spectacle to stir the blood and to remember for a lifetime. Colorado National Monument. On the desert border of far western Colorado, near Grand Junction, is a region of red sandstone which the erosion of the ages has carved into innumerable strange and grotesque shapes. Once a great plain, then a group of mesas, now it has become a city of grotesque monuments. Those who have seen the Garden of the Gods near Colorado Springs can imagine it multiplied many times in size, grotesqueness, complexity, and area. Such a vision will approximate the Colorado National Monument. The two regions have other relations in common, for as the Garden of the Gods flanks the Rockies' eastern slopes and looks eastward to the Great Plains, so does the Colorado National Monument flank the Rockies' western desert. Both are the disclosure by erosion of similar strata of red sandstone, which may have been more or less continuous before the Great Rockies wrinkled, lifted, and burst upward between them. The rock monuments of this group are extremely highly colored. They rise in several neighboring canyons, and some of them are of great height and fantastic design. One is a nearly circular column, with a diameter of 100 feet at the base and a height of more than 400 feet. Caves add to the attractions, and there are many springs among the tangled growths of the canyon floors. There are cedars and pinyon trees. The region abounds in mule deer and other wild animals. Capulin Mountain National Monument. After the sea bottom, which is now our desert southwest, rose for the last time and became the lofty plateau of today, many were the changes by which its surface became modified. Chief of these was the erosion, which has washed its levels thousands of feet below its potential altitude and carved it so remarkably. But it also became a field of widespread volcanic activity, and lavas and obsidians are constantly encountered among its gravels, sands, and shales. Many also are the cones of dead volcanoes. Capulin Mountain in northeastern New Mexico, near the Colorado line, is a very ancient volcano which retains its shape in nearly perfect condition. It was made a national monument for scientific reasons, but it also happily rounds out the national park's exhibit of the influences which created our wonderful Southwest. Its crater cone is composed partly of lava flow, partly of fine loose cinder, and partly of cemented volcanic ash. It is nearly a perfect cone. Capulin rises 1,500 feet from the plain to an altitude of 8,000 feet. Its crater is 1,500 feet across and 75 feet deep. To complete the volcanic exhibit, many blister cones are found around its base. It is easily reached from 2 railroads or by automobile. End of Part 28. Part 29 of the Book of the National Parks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Book of the National Parks by Robert Sterling Yard. The Muir Woods and Other National Monuments. National monuments which commemorate history, conserve forests, and distinguish conspicuous examples of world-making dot other parts of the United States besides the colorful Southwest. Their variety is great and the natural beauty of some of them unsurpassed. Their number should be much greater. Every history-helping exploration of the early days, from Cortiel's inspection of the upper Atlantic coast in 1501 and Ponce de Leon's exploration of Florida 11 years later, from Cambrillo's skirting of the Pacific coast in 1542 and Vancouver's entrance into Puget Sound in 1792, including every early expedition from north and south into the country now ours, and every exploration of the interior by our own people, should be commemorated, not by a slab of bronze or marble, but by a striking and appropriate area set apart as a definite memorial of the history of this nation's early beginnings. These areas should be appropriately located upon or overlooking some important or characteristic landmark of the explorations or events which they commemorated, and should have scenic importance sufficient to attract visitors and impress upon them the stages of the progress of this land from a condition of wilderness to settlement and civilization. Nor should it end here. The country is richly endowed, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, with examples of nature's amazing handicraft in the making of this continent, the whole range of which should be fully expressed in national reservations. Besides these, examples of our northeastern forests, the pines of the southern Appalachians, the Everglades of Florida, the tangled woodlands of the Gulf, and other typical forests which perchance may have escaped the desolation of civilization, should be added to the splendid forest reserves of the national parks of the West, first grown as nature made them, forever to remain untouched by the axe. Thus will the national park system become the real national museum for today and forever. There follows a brief catalogue of the slender and altogether fortuitous beginnings of such an exhibit. Muir Woods National Monument. One of the last remaining stands of original redwood forest easily accessible to the visitor is the Muir Woods in California. It occupies a picturesque canyon on the slope of Mount Tamalpais, north of the Golden Gate and opposite San Francisco, from which it is comfortably reached by ferry and railroad. It was rescued from the axe by William Kent of California, who jointly with Mrs. Kent gave it to the nation as an exhibit of the splendid forest which once crowded the shores of San Francisco Bay. It is named after John Muir, to whom this grove was a favorite retreat for many years. It exhibits many noble specimens of the California redwood, Sequoia sempervirens, cousin of the giant sequoia. Some of them attain a height of 300 feet, with a diameter exceeding 18 feet. They stand usually in clusters or family groups, their stems erect as pillars, their crowns joined in a lofty roof, rustling in the Pacific winds, musical with the songs of birds. Not even in the giant sequoia groves of the Sierra have I found any spot more cathedral-like than this. Its floor is brown and sweet-smelling, its aisles outlined by the tread of generations of worshippers. Its naves, transepts, alcoves, and sanctuaries are still and dim, yet filled mysteriously with light. The Muir Woods is a grove of noble redwoods, but it is much more. Apart from its main passages, in alcove, gateway, and outlying precinct, it is an exhibit of the rich Californian coast forest. The Douglas fir here reaches stately proportions. Many of the western oaks display their manifold picturesqueness. 100 lesser trees and shrubs add their grace and variety. The forest is typical and complete. Though small in scope, it is not a remnant, but naturally blends into its surroundings. The shaded North Hill slopes carry the great trees to the ridgeline. The southern slope exhibits the struggle for precedence with the mountain shrubs. At the lower end one bursts out into the grass country and the open hills. Every feature of the loveliest of all forests is at hand. The valley floor with its miniature trout stream overhung with fragrant azaleas, the brown carpet interwoven with azaleas and violets. There is the cool decoration of many ferns. The straight-growing redwoods compel a change of habit in the trees that would struggle towards a view of the sky. Mountain oaks and madrona are straight-trunked and clear of lower branches. There is rivalry of the strong and protection for the weak. The grove is, in truth, a complete expression in little of nature's forest plan. The characteristics of the greater redwood forests which require weeks or months to compass and careful correlation to bring into perspective here are exhibited within the rambling of a day. The Muir Woods is an entity. Its meadow borders, its dark ravines, its valley floor, its slopes and hilltops all show fullest luxuriance and perfect proportion. The struggle of the greater trees to climb the hills is exemplified as fully as in the great exhibits of the north, which spread over many miles of hill slope. Here one may see its range in half an hour. The coloring, too, is rich. The rusty foliage and bark, the brighter green of the shrubs, the brown carpet, the opal light, stirs the spirit. The powerful individuality of many of its trees is the source of never-ending pleasure. There is a redwood upon the West Fork which has no living base, but feeds vampire-like through another's veins, or, if you prefer the figure of family dependence so strikingly exemplified in these woods, has been rescued from destruction by a brother. The base of this tree has been completely girdled by fire. Impossible to draw subsistence from below, it stands up from a burned, naked, slender foundation. But another tree fell against it 25 or 30 feet above the ground, in some far-past storm, and lost its top. This tree pours its sap into the veins of the other to support its noble top. The twin cripples have become a single healthy tree. One of the most striking exhibits of the Muir Woods is its tangle of California laurel. Even in its deepest recesses, the bays, as they are commonly called, reach great size. They sprawl in all directions, bend at sharp angles, make great loops to enter the soil and root again. Sometimes they cross each other and join their trunks. In one instance, at least, a large crownless trunk has bent and entered head first the stem of still a larger tree. There are greater stands of virgin redwoods in the northern wilderness of California, which the ruthless lumberman has not yet reached, but is approaching fast. These are inland stands of giants, crowded like battalions, but there is no other Muir Woods with its miniature perfection. Devil's Postpile National Monument. Southeast of craggy Lyell, mountain climax and eastern outpost of the Yosemite National Park, the Muir Trail follows the extravagantly beautiful beginnings of the middle fork of the San Joaquin River through a region of myriad waters and snow-flecked mountains. Banner Peak, Ritter Mountain, Thousand Island Lake, Volcanic Ridge, Shadow Lake, national park scenery in its noblest expression, but not yet national park. A score of miles from Lyell, the trail follows the river into a volcanic bottom from whose forest rises the splendid group of pentagonal basaltic columns which was made a national monument in 1911 under the title of the Devil's Postpile. Those who know the famous Giant's Causeway of the Irish coast will know it in kind, but not in beauty. The enormous uplift which created the Sierra was accompanied on both its slopes by extensive volcanic eruptions, the remains of which are frequently visible to the traveler. The huge basaltic crystals of the Devil's Postpile were a product of this volcanic outpouring. They formed deep within the hot masses which poured over the region for miles around. Their upper ends have become exposed by the erosion of the ages, by which the cinder soil and softer rock around them have been worn away. The trail traveler comes suddenly upon this splendid group. It is elevated, as if it were the front of a small ridge, its posts standing on end, side by side in close formation. Below it, covering the front of the ridge down to the line of the trail, is an enormous talus mass of broken pieces. The appropriateness of the name strikes one at the first glance. This is really a post pile, every post carefully hewn to pattern, all of nearly equal length. The talus heap below suggests that His Satanic Majesty was utilizing it also as a woodpile, and had sawn many of the posts into lengths to fit the furnaces which we have been taught that he keeps hot for the wicked. Certainly it is a beautiful, interesting, and even an imposing spectacle. One also thinks of it as a gigantic organ, whose many hundred pipes rise many feet in air. Its lofty position, seen from the viewpoint of the trail, is one of dignity. It overlooks the pines and firs surrounding the clearing in which the observer stands. The trees on the higher level scarcely overtop it. In part, it is outlined against the sky. The Devil's Postpile, writes Professor Joseph N. LeConte, Muir's successor as the prophet of the Sierra, is a wonderful cliff of columnar basalt facing the river. The columns are quite perfect prisms, nearly vertical and fitted together like the cells of a honeycomb. Most of the prisms are pentagonal, though some are of 4 or 6 sides. The standing columns are about 2 feet in diameter and 40 feet high. At the base of the cliff is an enormous basalt structure, but wherever the bedrock is exposed beneath the pumice covering, the same formation can be seen. An error in the proclamation papers made the official title of this monument the Devil Postpile, and thus it must legally appear in all the official documents. The reservation also includes the Rainbow Fall of the San Juan River, one of the most beautiful waterfalls of the Sub-Sierra region, besides Soda Springs and Hot Springs. This entire reservation was originally included in the Yosemite National Park, but was cut out by an unappreciative committee appointed to revise boundaries. It is to be hoped that Congress will soon restore it to its rightful status. Devil's Tower National Monument. A structure similar in nature to the Devil's Postpile, but vastly greater in size and sensational quality, forms one of the most striking natural spectacles east of the Rocky Mountains. The Devil's Tower is unique. It rises with extreme abruptness from the rough Wyoming levels just west of the Black Hills. It is on the banks of the Belle Fourche River, which later, encircling the Black Hills around the north, finds its way into the Big Cheyenne and the Missouri. This extraordinary tower emerges from a rounded forested hill of sedimentary rock which rises 600 feet above the plain. From the top of that, the tower rises 600 feet, still higher. It is visible for 100 miles or more in every direction. Before the coming of the white man, it was the landmark of the Indians. Later it served a useful purpose in guiding the early explorers. Today it is the point which draws the eye for many miles. The visitor approaching by automobile sees it hours away, and its growth upon the horizon as he approaches is not his least memorable experience. It has the effect at a distance of an enormous up-pointing finger, which has been amputated just below the middle joint. When near enough to enable one to distinguish the upright flutings formed by its closely joined pentagonal basaltic prisms, the illusion vanishes. These, bending inward from a flaring base, straighten and become nearly perpendicular as they rise. Now one may fancy it the stump of a tree, more than 100 feet in diameter, whose top imagination sees piercing the low clouds. But close by, all similes become futile. Then the Devil's Tower can be likened to nothing but itself. This column is the core of a volcanic formation which doubtless once had a considerably larger circumference. At its base lies an immense talus of broken columns which the loosening frosts and the winter gales are constantly increasing. The process has been going on for untold thousands of years, during which the softer rock of the surrounding plains has been eroded to its present level. One may climb the hill and the talus. The column itself cannot be climbed except by means of special apparatus. Its top is nearly flat and elliptical, with a diameter varying from 60 to 100 feet. Pinnacles National Monument. 40 miles as the crow flies east of Monterey, California, in a spur of the low Coast Range, is a region which erosion has carved into many fantastic shapes. Because of its crowded, pointed rocks, it has been set apart under the title of the Pinnacles National Monument. For more than a century and a quarter, it was known as Vancouver's Pinnacles because the great explorer visited it while his ships lay at anchor in Monterey Bay, and afterward described it in his Voyages and Discoveries. It is unfortunate that the historical illusion was lost when it became a national reservation. 2 deep gorges, bordered by fantastic walls 600 to 1,000 feet high, and a broad semicircular, flower-grown amphitheater, constitute the central feature. Deep and narrow tributary gorges furnish many of the curious and intricate forms which for so many years have made the spot popular among sightseers. Rock masses have fallen upon the side walls of several of these lesser gorges, converting them into picturesque winding tunnels and changing deep alcoves into caves which require candles to see. It is a region of very unusual interest and charm. Shoshone Cavern National Monument. On the way to the Yellowstone National Park by way of the Wyoming entrance at Cody, and 3 miles east of the Great Shoshone Dam, a limestone cave has been set apart under the title of the Shoshone Cavern National Monument. The way in is rough and precipitous, and after entering the cave, a descent by rope is necessary to reach the chambers of unusual beauty. One may then journey for more than a mile through galleries, some of which are heavily encrusted with crystals. Lewis and Clark Cavern National Monument. Approaching the crest of the Rockies on the Northern Pacific Railroad, the Lewis and Clark Cavern is passed 50 miles before reaching Butte. Its entrance is perched 1,300 feet above the broad valley of the Jefferson River, which the celebrated explorers followed on their westward journey. It overlooks 50 miles of their course. The cavern, which has the usual characteristics of a limestone cave, slopes sharply back from its main entrance, following the dip of the strata. Some of its vaults are decorated in great splendor. The depredations of vandals were so damaging that in 1916 its entrance was closed by an iron gate. This cavern is the only memorial of the Lewis and Clark expedition in the national park system. There is no record that the explorers entered it or knew of its existence. 230 miles east of the cavern, Clark inscribed his name and the date, July 25, 1806, upon the face of a prominent butte known as Pompey's Pillar. This would have been a far more appropriate monument to the most important of American explorations than the limestone cave. In fact, the Department of the Interior once attempted to have it proclaimed a national monument. The fact that it lay within an Indian allotment prevented. The entire course of this great expedition should be marked at significant points by appropriate national monuments. Wind Cave National Park. In the southwest corner of South Dakota, on the outskirts of the Black Hills, is one of the most interesting limestone caverns of the country. It was named Wind Cave because with the changes of temperature during the day, strong currents of wind blow alternately into and out of its mouth. It has many long passages and fine chambers gorgeously decorated. It is a popular resort. The United States Biological Survey maintains a game preserve. Jewel Cave National Monument. Northwest of Wind Cave, 13 miles west and south of Custer, South Dakota boasts another limestone cavern of peculiar beauty, through whose entrance also the wind plays pranks. It is called Jewel Cave because many of its crystals are tinted in various colors, often very brilliantly. Under torchlight, the effect is remarkable. Connecting chambers have been explored for more than 3 miles, and there is much of it yet unknown. Oregon Caves National Monument. In the far southwestern corner of Oregon, about 30 miles south of Grants Pass, upon slopes of coast mountains and at an altitude of 4,000 feet, is a group of large limestone caves which have been set apart by presidential proclamation under the title of the Oregon Caves National Monument. Locally, they are better known as the Marble Halls of Oregon. There are 2 entrances at different levels, the passages and chambers following the dip of the strata. A considerable stream, the outlet of the waters which dissolve these caves in the solid limestone, passes through. The wall decorations, and in some of the chambers the stalagmites and stalactites, are exceedingly fine. The vaults and passages are unusually large. There is one chamber 25 feet across, whose ceiling is believed to be 200 feet high. Mount Olympus National Monument. For 60 miles or more east and west across the Olympian Peninsula, which is the forested northwestern corner of Washington and the United States between Puget Sound and the Pacific Ocean, stretch the Olympian Mountains. The country is a rugged wilderness of tumbled ranges, grown with magnificent forests, above which rise snowy and glaciered summits. Its climax is Mount Olympus, 8,100 feet in altitude, rising about 25 miles equidistant from the Strait of Juan de Fuca upon the north and the Pacific Ocean upon the west. The entire peninsula is extremely wild. It is skirted by a road along its eastern and part of its northern edges, connecting the waterfront towns. Access to the mountain is by arduous trail. The reservation contains 950 square miles. Although possessing unusual scenic beauty, it was reserved for the purpose of protecting the Olympic elk, a species peculiar to the region. Deer and other wild animals also are abundant. Wheeler National Monument. High under the Continental Divide in southwestern Colorado, near Creede, a valley of high altitude, grotesquely eroded in tufa, rhyolite, and other volcanic rock, is named the Wheeler National Monument in honor of Captain George Montague Wheeler, who conducted geographical explorations between 1869 and 1879. Its deep canyons are bordered by lofty pinnacles of rock. It is believed that General John C. Fremont here met the disaster which drove back his exploring party of 1848, fragments of harness and camp equipment and skeletons of mules having been found. Verendrye National Monument. The first exploration of the northern United States east of the Rocky Mountains is commemorated by the Verendrye National Monument at the old crossing of the Missouri River in North Dakota. Here rises Crow High Butte on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, an eminence commanding a wide view in every direction. Verendrye, the celebrated French explorer, started from the north shore of Lake Superior about 1740 and passed westward and southward into the regions of the Great Plains. He or his sons, for the records of their journeys are confusing, passed westward into Montana along a course which Lewis and Clark paralleled in 1806, swung southward in the neighborhood of Fort Benton, and skirted the Rockies nearly to the middle of Wyoming, passing within a couple of 100 miles of the Yellowstone National Park. Crow High Butte is supposed to have given the Verendryes their first extensive view of the upper Missouri. The butte was long a landmark to guide early settlers to Old Crossing. Sully's Hill National Park. Congress created the Sully's Hill National Park in North Dakota in 1904 in response to a local demand. Its hills and meadows constitute a museum of practically the entire flora of the state. The United States Biological Survey maintains there a wild animal preserve for elk, bison, antelope, and other animals representative of the northern plains. Sitka National Monument. On Baranof Island, upon the southeastern shore of Alaska, is a reservation known as the Sitka National Monument, which commemorates an important episode in the early history of Alaska. On this tract, which lies within a mile of the steamboat landing at Sitka, formerly stood the village of the Kick City Indians who, in 1802, attacked the settlement of Sitka and massacred the Russians who had established it. 2 years later, the Russians under Baranof recovered the settlement from the Indians, contrary to the active opposition of Great Britain, and established the title which they afterward transferred to the United States. Graves of some of those who fell in the later battle may be seen. The reservation is also a fine example of the forest and flora of the Alexander Archipelago. 16 totem poles remain from the old native days. Old Kasan National Monument. Remains of the rapidly passing native life of the Alexander Archipelago on the southeast coast of Alaska are conserved in the Old Kasan National Monument on the east shore of Prince of Wales Island. The village of Old Kasan, occupied for many years by the Haida tribe and abandoned a decade or more ago, contains several community houses of split timber, each of which consists of a single room with a common fireplace in the middle, under a smoke hole in the center of the roof. Cedar sleeping booths, each the size of an ordinary piano box, are built around the wall. The monument also possesses 50 totem poles, carved and richly colored. Of the 36 national monuments, 24 are administered by the National Park Service, 10 by the Department of Agriculture, and 2 by the War Department. Congress made the assignments to the Department of Agriculture on the theory that, as these monuments occurred in forests, they could be more cheaply administered by the Forest Service. But as many of the other monuments and nearly all the national parks also occur in forests, the logic is not apparent, and these monuments suffer from disassociation with the impetus and machinery of the National Park Service. The Big Hole Battlefield National Monument, about 55 miles southwest of Butte, Montana, was assigned to the War Department because a battle took place there in 1877 between a small force of United States troops and a large force of Indians. End of Part 29. End of the Book of the National Parks by Robert Sterling Yard.